Hello guys, Chris here and welcome to episode 24 of the Pocket Podcast. This one is with the legendary Tobi Pearce. Now, it's funny, before I even started the podcast, I did a roadmap of all of my dream guests and the people that I really wanted to speak to on this show. And Tobi was one of those. And it's so cool to see that I can actually get him on, especially this soon into my podcast journey. So thank you guys all so much for the support on this journey so far and all the growth with the show. I'm absolutely amazed by all the feedback and all the support I'm getting. So thank you guys so much. But Tobi has such an awesome story. He exited Sweat for $300 million. He is a leader and sets the standard here in Australia for business and entrepreneurship. And I was blessed to be able to sit down with him today and we can unpack his story and a lot of lessons that he has learned along his journey to get him to where he is today. You know what we do on the Pocket here? We like to deep dive into different parts of their story that make it special. Tobi was homeless when he was 16 years old. He left when he got his license for school and he left to go to school one day and then never came back home, and he was sleeping out of his car at friends' couches in a tent at times in a park. And to come from that to where he is today is so awesome. And what we find with a lot of these people that we speak to, a lot of these high achievers, is they've come from somewhere quite low and that's been their fuel to slingshot them forward. I learned so much from this episode and I'm so excited for you guys to learn the amount that I did too. It's a game changer. So without further ado, that's enough of me talking. Let's dive straight into the show with Tobi. We need to take a minute to thank our sponsors of the podcast, Switch Nutrition. More specifically, I want to talk about these two products right here and foundational health. There are so many different supplements online and different people telling you this and that, but it's so important that we strip it right back to what are the foundations that our body actually needs to make sure we're putting our best foot forward every single day. And these two products, I take one first thing in the morning and one directly just before bed. And I sleep like a baby and I feel energized and hydrated when I take this one in the morning. So the Hydrate, I take with a liter of water. It's also got a nootropic in it called coffee berry, which helps me prolong having my coffee throughout the day because it's a nootropic that helps with brain function. So I can get my work done early in the morning without taking any caffeine supplements or coffee. And then the Adrenal is a sleep formula that I have before bed every single night. The chocolate flavor I make kind of like a hot chocolate. And this is amazing. It's well renowned. It's the best thing in the market. They've been around for like 8 years now. Maybe even more. Don't quote me on that one. But I've been taking it for at least 3 years myself. And every single night I love this and I look forward to this. So if you want to try out any of Switch's products, you can actually go to the link in the description down below or the show notes and you go to my collections page on their website. It has these two supplements alongside some of the other ones that I do take, and you can use code Chris Griffin and you'll get 20% off your entire order. Or you can just go to switchnutrition.com.au and use the code Chris Griffin and you'll get 20% off all of your order. Without further ado, you guys enjoy this platform now where I get to meet with all these people that I used to look up to. It's awesome. Yeah. It's very
At the end of the day, man, you just realize that, $1, a million, 10, 100, a billion, it's sort of like everyone's kind of still the same.
Yeah.
I mean, some people obviously are kind of inherently more or less knowledgeable and experienced, but yeah, you realize really quickly that like the amount of money that people make doesn't really have any relationship to how good they are at something.
Yeah. Do you think though that the amount of money people make, the characteristics that it takes to make that money, especially if you make it from scratch, you become like a bit
there are certainly some universal characteristics for sure. But I think like the idea of I commonly talk about this idea of like the ultimate entrepreneur identity. So it's like if I wanted to design myself, my personality, my behavior to position myself to be the best possible entrepreneur, what would it be? It's like in some regards that's impossible to answer, because I know some people who are actually really unstructured. Yeah, lots of people with those like characteristics that you would look at them and go like, oh, there's no way that a person that is and behaves that way can be successful. But then they go on to make a huge amount of money. Yeah. So horses for courses, I think, in some regard.
It's cool to have that perspective though. And I also think that you need to, like, it's valuable for someone like you to say that because you've made the money. But too many people don't make money, never try, and then they say, oh, it won't change anything.
100%.
And you kind of need to be at that level.
Yeah, and also, like, I think one of the funniest ideas is, just as a macro example, from a business perspective, like business podcast perspective, most people that are guests on business podcasts are successful because people want to hear ideally from successful people. But normally by the time a person is successful enough to be on a podcast to be having this conversation, the questions that are being asked are answered from a position of their current knowledge, right? So But back when that person was not massively successful, whoever they are, at the beginning of their journey, they don't have any of that knowledge. Yeah, and so it's an interesting kind of dilemma in that regard, in the sense that, you know, people who are on here are successful, they ask questions, they answer them with their knowledge. But when they actually started, they didn't have that knowledge and they still were able to become successful. So a lot of the people listening have this, in some regard, unrealistic perspective that, like, oh, well, if I listen to these people who are smart and successful, I'll take their knowledge and advice and become successful. But it's not the knowledge or advice that actually initially made them successful, because they started their journey without it. You know, what made them successful was just the commitment to doing stuff repeatedly for a long time. Right, like,
and getting back up when you get slammed on your face.
Yeah, 100%. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking a second ago about like the podcast idea. It's like, you're not going to get a lot of views in your first 3, 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 podcasts. But by the time you get to whatever the number may be, the compounding value and the accumulation of growth that you get becomes so overwhelmingly large that it would be irrational not to continue. The same argument happens in the inverse. Is like, well, early on, the underwhelming amount of kind of views, listens, progress, whatever it may be, the only rational response would be to stop going.
And we spoke about Hormozy before we walked in, and he spoke about the videos that were getting 2 views.
Yep.
I don't care if they get 2 views, because I know when I blow up, people are going to go back and watch them, and then they're going to get heaps of views anyway, but then they're going to have more perspective.
Yeah, because people misappropriate success or failure. So like in that example, you could be a person with no public brand, no following, nothing at all, and you could post an incredibly good piece of content that otherwise would have gone viral, but because your starting base is effectively 0, it's never going to go viral, no matter how good the content is. It takes time to accumulate a base to then allow the numbers to compound. And to the point, if he was to take a video that he made when he started, maybe it wouldn't be produced as nice, maybe it wouldn't be as articulate, etc., etc. But if he took the exact same content and reposted it now, it'd obviously get substantially more views because the base is higher. The platform is bigger for him now.
And it's interesting how you're speaking about how the people that are coming on the podcast have already achieved some level of success. They're not. It's not actually what got them there in the first place. They're speaking about their knowledge after the fact.
Yeah, and also too, like, for people who have, let's just say you're 10 years into your journey, you've achieved some level of success, regardless of how significant it is. From an honesty standpoint, it's quite hard for those individuals to actually relate to the position of most of the listeners. Because, yes, of course, once they were not hyper successful, not wealthy, not knowledgeable and experienced, they were a beginner with no money, no knowledge, no experience. But after a decade or so, it's really hard to relate back to that. It's really hard to remember back to that. So, the funniest example is people will ask someone 10 years into the journey, how did you get started and why were you so successful early on? They can't even remember. The honest truth is they don't even really have any recollection. And even at that time, they didn't really know why things were working. They were just doing what they thought was right because they didn't have enough knowledge or experience to actually have a reasonable argument to say, well, it works because of this. They didn't even have enough knowledge to have that. It was all just intuitive, early on.
Yeah. And I think what's powerful though about having conversations like this and even hearing people's stories that have made it and have achieved levels of success, and even that next step further, just a mentor as a whole, like looking at someone that has what you or that you want.
Yep.
Understanding that they're not going to do the work for you. You're supposed to actually just take what they've done and have that belief that it's possible. It's like a mentor's role. And I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this now that you're mentoring a lot of businesses is, in my eyes, I kind of go, because I get people reaching out all the time about how do you deal with, how do you find a mentor? I've got this opportunity with this mentor of mine. How should I treat or act with this person? Yeah. And I kind of go, it's really important to note that a mentor's not going to do it for you. They're supposed to expose you to what's possible and give you the belief that it's possible, and then teach you their lessons that they learn along their journey. But then you've got to go out on your own journey and learn that, and hopefully maybe be guided by the lessons that they've learned so you don't make the same mistakes.
Yeah, 100%. And, the general idea with you're having a person mentor you in your journey, any journey, but in this particular case, in context is business. The whole idea of having a mentor is that the amount of money that you pay them is drastically less than the amount of money that you would have otherwise lost or wasted by doing work that should not have been done. So I commonly like to add some layers here. What's the difference between a coach and a mentor, right? A coach is someone, typically they will kind of ask you questions and push you and develop you and lead you in this way. A mentor may do coaching, but a mentor typically is someone who's walked in your shoes and as a result of that can save you time by sharing knowledge from their journey. So there's a subtle nuance there, right? Like a coach doesn't necessarily actually have to have done what you've done. So all psychologists are coaches. They may not necessarily have experienced everything you're experiencing, but they are great at guiding you to come to your own conclusions. A mentor is someone who ideally has been through most of what you are or are about to go through and can say, hey, actually don't walk in this direction. That's a 6 or 12 month waste of time. This is the direction you want to walk in. And then to your point, they don't do any of the work for you. The learning from a mentor comes from doing the work. Realizing that they pointed you in this direction because they understand something that you don't. And this is one of the core issues that you see very commonly with founders and or just successful people in any field is there's a really irrational argument to have a mentor or a coach, right? Insofar as if you've reached a decent level of success, someone who perhaps is less humble could say, well, I've gotten here on my own because I was great at problem solving and great at learning and development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I got here all on my own. I didn't need anyone's help to get here. So why do I need any help to get there, right? Someone who is more humble might say, I'm very good at what I do. I've come very far as a result of my own problem solving skills, but I respect the fact that other people know more than me and have had experiences that I've not had. And then there is inherently a significant benefit in utilizing that knowledge that costs money to acquire. So the investment is in avoiding time wasting and inefficient capital deployment if you wanted to be kind of mechanical about it.
And I think that whole thing around, I don't need someone, it's kind of like, no, you don't. You don't need it.
Yeah.
But are they going to help you save some mistakes? Yes, potentially. Yeah. Have they lived, and this is another interesting thing, is something that's so important for a mentor or a coach, is they need to have lived or achieved the things that you want. Because it's funny, I get DMs all the time, and there was this one that sticks out in particular about how she won an award where she got given a mentor.
Yeah.
And I said, and I was thinking there, I'm going, okay, you don't know this person, A. The mentor is supposed to be someone that you look to and go, he's got what I want, or she's got what I want, and they're going to help me get there and teach me their lessons. And I'm inspired by what they have is what the way I see it as well. Yep. I need to be inspired by my mentor. If you just get given someone you've never met and it's like, oh, this is your mentor, and you're getting 5 free classes with them, and you're asking me how you should deal with that mentor in those classes. Yep. I go, has he been through what you're about to go through, and does he have what you want to have? And if the answer is no, and the answer was no for this person because it was an MLM thing and it was all incentivized and it was all a mess, right? And I kind of go like, these people, it's so important that you actually look up to this person and you're inspired by this person to be a mentor. Yeah,
it's all a trust thing. And you use the word kind of incentivize there. So there's this fascinating repeated experience that comes up in business again and again and again for a variety of reasons. And that basically is,
we're going to get back to speaking with Toby in just 1 minute, but first I want to tell you about this thing that is on my wrist called a Whoop, the ultimate health and fitness tracker. It's a game changer when it comes to achieving your health and fitness goals. I've been working with Whoop for so long now, and that's because I genuinely love it. The only time it leaves my wrist is when I change the color of the band and put something crazy like the one that I have on right now. But if you guys want to try out Whoop for yourself, then make sure you go to the link in the description of the show notes below, or go to join.whoop.com/Chris, and you'll get 1 month completely free, and they'll send you out a band for you to try Whoop for yourself for 1 month. Now, what I'm going to do is, for one of you that decide to pick up a Whoop with my link, I'm going to give you another band of your choice, whatever color that you want online, valued up to nearly $150, completely free. I'm going to send it to your door as well. So all you need to do is take a screenshot of your order after you use it with my link, and I'm going to be choosing one of you that orders one of the Whoops in the first 7 days of this episode airing. Without further ado, let's get back to the show.
The idea of using a lawyer or an accountant as a business advisor or mentor for almost all small to medium-sized businesses is a terrible idea. And the reason is because, one, if they are a lawyer or an accountant, unless they built their own law firm, they're not necessarily actually experienced business people. There's a massive misunderstanding here that, oh, well, this person's been in accounting for 30 years, they're great at business. The objective truth is that most accountants who've been accounting for 30 years are barely even good at accounting, let alone anything else outside of accounting, i.e. the entire picture of business, right? So that's one big issue. The second big issue is that lawyers and accountants, well, what is the value to them in being your mentor? Well, you generate further dependence on their service. Their incentive is not, oh, I'm going to make you as much money as possible because that's the best thing for you. It's like, well, yes, I hope that you're successful, but also this means that if I'm your kind of advisor as your lawyer and accountant, well, then I've kind of got you as a client for 3, 5, 7 years, maybe longer, right? And so people I've often found, and even in my own experience, both having mentors and mentoring people, the best relationships for me have actually been, relationships that didn't need to exist, but wanted to exist, right? So, from my perspective, the best founders that I work with are not founders that are actually in dire straits and have immediately bad problems to solve in their business. The best ones to work with are the ones that just want to get better, right? Because they're intrinsically motivated to improve. They're not trying to solve one individual specific problem, right? And, the other way around, like if I can, so my, mentor who I've worked with for many years, he doesn't need my money. He's independently wealthy, right? He does it because it's interesting to him and there's other values to him that he gets from it other than just the money. So whether or not I make, 1, 10, 100, whatever dollars, there's no change in our relationship. It's exactly the same, right? But the lawyer and accountant scenario is they have a massive incentive to kind of keep you happy. But mentoring isn't about happiness, it's about progress. And sometimes the two don't necessarily align.
That's interesting. And I guess the thing when I look at mentors as well is every time I have a mentor and I look at something and they're invested in mentoring me, I feel like they see their younger self in them. When I look at like someone that I want to help, I look at it and go, I know how you're feeling. I've been there.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to help them and I feel connected to that. And I feel like my mentors feel the same way where they go, oh, I see my younger self when I was trying to give it a crack back then.
Yep.
And I think that's a powerful thing. But what an interesting thing is you just said there is a lot of the time progression's not tied to happiness.
Yeah,
progression and happiness are different.
Yeah, progression and happiness are not unrelated, but they're not one-to-one related. And what I mean by that is that, every time that everything you have to do to progress makes you happy. That's fundamentally untrue. If anything, the inverse is more likely to be true, i.e. the things that you need to do to progress typically make you temporarily unhappy. So just in a simple sense, like if you want to progress in the gym, you have to train harder or lift more weights, i.e. you have to be willing to absorb a greater degree of resistance and load. That's not necessarily enjoyable or joyful, in a simple sense. And in business, the emotional journey is in many regards quite confronting. So you just as a couple of very common examples. So, okay, you've been running this business, you got to $20 million a year in revenue. Congratulations. That's awesome. Well, if you want to get to $100 million in revenue, the entire way that you do all of this is wrong and needs to go in the bin because that's not going to scale. It will not withhold or handle the level of stress and pressure from a systems perspective that is required to tolerate this size, right? And so unless a founder is willing to accept that they did a great job getting here, that's really, really good. But the reality is that what you've built won't get you where you want to go, and therefore it's wrong. And there's a really important nuance here that founder is effectively abandoning or letting go of prior knowledge to make room for new knowledge. And that as an experience is inherently anxiety inducing. So, if you think about that in any other context, when people have believed something for a very long time and then they're presented with an overwhelming degree of evidence or suggestion that perhaps that's not true, that's actually a really, really confronting scenario for anyone in any scenario. And so from a mentoring perspective, your job isn't about managing the happiness of the people that you work with. Hopefully it's about creating a, where possible, low stress and progressive environment to allow the individual to develop, to get where they need to go. But this relates back to another really critical part of being a good mentor or coach or advisor, which is that your job is, if the individual skill set is currently at this level, where they want to get in business requires it at this level, your job is to meet them here and then get them here. Your job is not meant to go here from here, because going from kind of A to Z from a development perspective almost always results in abandonment or failure. The simple example, again, using the gym is I say, I've never run before. I'm going to go out for a 20K run this weekend. Well, you're probably going to fail. There's a very high likelihood you fail. That failure will be failure in the face of a huge shortcoming more often than not. And that's then a net negative emotional experience that is largely going to drive people to abandon ship. So to get from A to Z, first you have to kind of go A to B, B to C, C to D. And great mentors are really good at kind of laying breadcrumbs and stepping stones, to allow people to kind of go on that progressive journey.
Yeah, play matches, win matches, and just keep going.
Yep.
I agree with that, and how you have to let go of some old beliefs to free up new ones, and to take it to the next step. I really want to go back to this progression thing though, because I'm really fascinated by it. Because I want to get your thoughts more, because I don't really sit in the same belief straight away. So it's I'm really intrigued, because for me, I understand that to get to the next level and to progress, you're going to have to go through some hardships, some uncomfortable phases. But when I'm stagnant in any area, if it's the gym, in relationships, in business, I really struggle to be happy in that thing.
Sure.
When I'm stagnant, right? Yeah. So for me, striving to be progressing is something that does bring me a lot of happiness. I find a lot of the time my happiness is tied to progression a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting statement, right? And it's not so much that it's kind of right, wrong, true or untrue, but there's a really interesting idea here, right? And so we'll explore this by starting from the current position. Is mastery, so becoming absolutely an expert at something, enjoyable?
The pursuit of it might not
achieving
be.
It.
Achieving it, yes, it is.
Yeah. And so if you look at this from an emotional standpoint, right? You start a particular skill, whatever it may be. The day that you start is effectively, theoretically, the worst that you'll be at it. Every day after that, you get better, right? The incremental amount that you get better declines over time. It's not linear in the sense that, I get 10 units of improvement, then 9, then 8, then 7, right? But in a simple sense, early on, you are building bigger blocks, you're adding bigger levels of detail and knowledge, so your initial progression feels bigger, right? The better that you get at any particular activity, the greater your relationship with boredom, right? Because let's say you're studying a particular topic, I know 0, there's 100 units of information, I currently know 0. In the first 6 months, I consume 30 of those units. In the next 6 months, I consume 20, and so on and so forth. To consume the last 10 units might take you 10 years. To consume the first 90 units might take you 2 years, right? And the reality of that is two things. One, as you learn more about a particular topic, the available net new information to learn is less. So you have to work harder to find net new information, number one. And number two, the more information that you accumulate on a particular topic, you then realize that accumulation of knowledge isn't mastery. Development of your own integrated system is mastery. So you then have to temporarily abandon consumption of content, and then you have to move to creation of content. And so the pursuit of mastery in any field, whether it be sport, business, any other particular subject matter, is actually one intimate relationship to develop comfort with boredom, because it progressively becomes more boring. So what do we get here? To come back to your initial statement, the pursuit of progress is directly tied to your happiness. That's a current belief or a perception that you have about that experience. And for most people, it is that way. But if your happiness is directly linked to the amount of progress you perceive that you are making, then you will only ever theoretically get so far, because you have to at some point in time get happy with the fact that you feel like you're not progressing at all, because that's when you're actually beginning to get to a higher level of knowledge.
That is so interesting. And this is why I love having conversations like this, because you're at a level where that amount that you can learn is a lot less than what you used to. And
it's boring as all hell, to be frank. Like in some cases, it's boring as all hell. Like, so, yeah, I am kind of academically interested in the idea of business management and strategy, right? And after you've read, Mintzberg, Drucker, Porter, a variety of these other kind of your business academics, Jim Collins, depending on kind of how you perceive their views. Once you've read all of that material, and some of them agree and disagree with each other, well, what do you read next? Yeah, then you go back and you read, person XYZ's thing. It's like, but 95% of what they said is kind of an alternate distillation of, what Drucker said 60 years ago.
So I guess the only way to find new stuff is by doing.
Yeah, 100%.
And that's what you're saying, by creating the content. And so that comes down to actually the action in your life.
Yeah.
But this is an awesome lesson that I've just learned from you just now, which is amazing, about how you're saying earlier on in your journey, you're progressing at a lot faster rate.
Yeah.
And that is exciting. But what happens is, over time, when you get so good at something, the progression's so little. And if your happiness is tied to progression, you're not going to be happy all the time, because 100%. It's going to be very hard. Well, so you need to eliminate that belief.
Yeah. And like, if we just use the realm of business as an example, if we follow that theory, so you make far more progress in terms of your learning development early on than you do later on. Your capacity to generate money becomes exponentially greater later on. So although you make more progress early on and it feels like fun, and this is one of the kind of paradoxes of the founder's journey, right? At the beginning, I knew nothing. I did something that was somewhat successful, and then I made $5 million in 3 years. That is a huge amount of money relative to what I was making before. On the spectrum of skill as a business person, you're still like a white belt, or a rookie, right? After another 5, 10, 15 years, if you're really clever and really diligent and really disciplined, you get to the point where you can't just make money in your business. You can kind of make money in most or any businesses. And so early on, you might make more initial progress, but your capacity to actually generate results is substantially less than when you start slowing down in progress later in the journey as you get closer to or strive, for mastery. Your capacity to generate results is actually much larger then. So your progress slows down, but your capacity to generate value grows. And so there's an interesting relationship too here between knowledge and skill or capability. So you can read all the business books in the world. So coming back to the point you said before about action, you can read all the business books in the world, marketing, whatever the hell it may be. You could watch every basketball game in the world and talk to all the best basketball coaches. Doesn't mean you can shoot 3-pointers, right? So to be great at anything is the kind of bridge and or integration between knowledge and skill or capability. So if you read lots of business books, doesn't mean you can manage a team. You can understand the general ideas. People management's about getting things done the right way. Leadership's about figuring out, what things are worth doing? What are the right things to do? Okay, well, from a leadership management perspective, I've told the team, these are the right things to do, and this is why I want to get done. Cool, go. But then you realize, there's change management, performance management, there's different personalities. How do you get them to get along? There's communication systems. There's all of this other stuff that you might have read about, but to do it in real time is a lot harder, than simply, I can rewrite or regurgitate what I read in Drucker's Effective Executive in Action, right? So
yeah, so it's in finding this balance of knowledge and then actually skill, and I think coming through failures and actually doing it and having to and an awesome quote that you wrote down was growth and comfort never coexist.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's an interesting concept because like when you're comfortable and you know how to do something, you're not growing because you already know how to do it.
Yeah,
and so I guess through the action of discomfort and not knowing how to do something, you're going to learn. And that's going to be that practical skill. And it comes back down to like when you're talking about coaches that actually haven't done the things or mentors, same as a business teacher that works at a school or a uni.
Same.
Never done anything.
Yeah.
I wanna go to before the show, and I got you to write down a quote for me.
Sure. What did I write?
It was something that you love, mate. Something that came to mind straight away from Charlie Munger.
Oh, beautiful. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And you wrote, "It is remarkable how much long-term advantage people like us have gotten by trying to be consistently not stupid instead of trying to be very intelligent."
Yeah. So there's that sounds really obvious, but it's not at all obvious. It's quite profound, in the sense that, again, if you talk to a lot of business people and you read a lot of media headlines, you see, this person was so smart, they figured this out, that no one figured it out, blah, 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 whatever. And those things may be true and they may also work in the short term. But the only thing that works kind of consistently in the long term, and I talk about this idea quite a lot with my management teams, which is that the only way to be bigger than are your competitors sustainably is to be better. The only way to be better is to keep playing the game longer. The only way to keep playing the game longer is to make less mistakes, right? And so there was a really awesome piece of content actually that was on social media recently by Roger Federer, and I may completely mess up these stats, but it's something along the lines of he's one of the greatest of all time tennis players, but he's only won 55% of all points he's ever played. Wow. So he's only just better, on average than his competitors. And there's kind of further layers to this, but in tennis we also know that the majority of points that are won don't actually come from hitting winners. They come from errors, either forced or unforced errors on the other player's part, right? And business in some regards is kind of the same. The only difference is that you can't see their strokes, you can't see their scoreboard, you can't kind of see any of that. So if you observe businesses from the outside, and very commonly e-com's a great one for this, all of our competitors doing so much cool stuff. They're running these cool events. They've got these cool new products. Oh my God, they're branding, that photo shoot, this, that, the other. And it's like, yep. And that can be a real big lure into, trying to be smarter than other people. But the reality is you don't need to be smarter. You're just going to make less mistakes. And so we're focused on doing things that are not smart, but instead doing things that are not silly. And this is, just to be clear, boring stuff, right? So rather than focusing on what the wonderful marketing activities you're going to do are, why don't you get really disciplined with your P&L and figure out how much money you're wasting every year? But people don't, that's less sexy.
Less exciting, yeah.
Less sexy.
It's not Instagrammable.
100%. And so this is the kind of conflation of the idea of a founder who wants to be successful, but they conflate, founders conflate success as money and status a lot of the time. But business is very clear on what success is. It's performance metrics. It's not how cool the business looks. The business only needs to look cool in order to hit its success metrics. So that's an input to achieve the outcome, right? The outcome for business is not looking cool. That's an input. It's a strategic decision, right? But founders kind of misappropriate that and they're like, well, I'm successful. I make heaps of money, but if I'm also cool and smarter than everyone.
Yeah, and I guess the metric you're saying it's based on metrics, and as you said before the podcast, in terms of why you're investing in certain companies, is it are you trying to have one that's got an exit strategy, or is it more of a cash flow business? Which one are you going for? And then the success of that business is based on those metrics.
Yeah, well, and this is the thing too, right? How many founders do you see? And just to be clear, I when I was much younger, I had this belief in my career too. I was like, I'll just build this company, make it massive, make it worth heaps of money, and just sell it, right? But if you look at that from a data perspective, you go, well, okay, let's do some filtering. How many businesses are there that ever exit? So out of 100 businesses that start, or 1 million businesses start, how many businesses actually exit? It's it is minute. Well less than 1%, given that depending on the industry, generically in America, Australia, whatever, most English-speaking Western societies, about 4/5 of most businesses that ever start or ever get registered are dead within sort of 3 years, give or take, depending on country and category, right? So if 4 out of 5 businesses are dead in 3 years, you roll that forward another sort of 3 to 5 years, another 4/5 of those businesses are effectively dead. So you've only got a few percent of businesses who are even left alive, after a certain period of time, let alone profiting, let alone valuable, let alone saleable or appealing, to other people, right? But that falls under the idea of, well, I want to be smarter than everyone. I'm going to pull the wool over their eyes and achieve this goal, which does happen sometimes. But coming back to the other statement that I said around, well, if you want to be better, as you want to be bigger than your competitors, you're going to be better sustainably. Well, sustainability is about not making your decisions based on things that could happen, making your decisions based on things that are likely to happen. And there's a very subtle and sophisticated nuance in that statement, that is that really intelligent business people are making decisions and judgment calls, or bets, if you will, every day of the week. But the really good business people make bets that typically satisfy a few criteria. One, they're more likely than not to occur. Two, they're more likely than not to occur because of some data, legitimate objective data they're able to base their decision on. And three, ideally, they're two-way doors. And what I mean by that is that, I'm not going to put $100% of my wealth in one investment that could fail, right? So they have distributed risk management, if you want to think about it that way, right? Earlier on, founders will make decisions based on what they believe to be true, but that belief could be intuition and emotion, not so much data. Or even if they believe they're using data, they don't have a well-rounded and sophisticated enough understanding of the data to actually come to a commercially adjusted, kind of decision. And third, risk is almost not even considered because they haven't yet realize that the most important thing in investment decision making is capital preservation. It's not a generation of a return.
What do you mean by that?
Right. So if you want to win in the long term, not win in the short term, in the long term, well, in order to win in the long term, first you must still be playing, right?
So you need cash.
In order to still be playing, you must not permanently destroy your capital, or PCD, permanent capital destruction. In order to not permanently destroy your capital, you have to find ways to distribute that capital in a manner that if you lose some, you won't lose all. That idea is not even really considered. So to give you another example to reinforce that, Charlie Munger from that quote, who, rest in peace recently, his business partner was Warren Buffett. You could argue plus or minus a few players of the game, they're probably the best investors in the last 50 to 100 years. That's reasonable, objectively, based on their results. So if that's true, then it's like, well, they probably understand things we don't. Coming back to the mentoring thing, they probably understand things we don't. Okay, well, if we look at that and we say, well, I'm unlikely to meet Warren this week and learn from him as my mentor. So how else would I gain his knowledge? It's like, well, I would probably look at what information has he consumed to build his philosophy on investing. Well, he publicly claims that his biggest influence was Ben Graham, who wrote a book called The Intelligent Investor, right? And you got to assume that he was obviously pretty intelligent and well-rounded if Warren Buffett's claiming that he was his biggest influence. So if we go down that rabbit hole and then you open The Intelligent Investor, and I think it's in the first or second chapter, he talks about, well, what actually is the idea of investing? Or what is a good investment? And the definition is something, to the effect that a good investment decision is one that through thorough analysis, i.e. usage of data, promises the protection of capital or principal, i.e. it's not going to destroy your money, and an adequate return. So in that order, it must be based on data, it must not lose my money, and then hopefully I make some return. People who are early on in their journey don't think that way. They think, how do I get the most money as quickly as possible?
Never based on data.
No consideration for data, no consideration for risk. And if that was true, then because if they did consider those things, well, the majority of public trading wouldn't work. The majority of crypto wouldn't work, so on and so forth, because thorough analysis and capital preservation or protection don't exist. Now, people have different risk profiles and interest levels, right? But in a general sense, from a business, in order for the business to continue trading forever, it has to primarily walk through two-way doors, investment decisions that they can survive and continue to trade from. And it primarily has to focus on generating an incremental return so as to not to absorb so much risk that the company ends up dying. Now, that principle's, it's very important to remember that principle matters in the context of long-term. If you're in your early 20s trying to build your first business or second, third, have a crack at, whatever, absorb all the risk, destroy all of your capital, make all of the mistakes or whatever, because you're not focused on long-term, you're focused on kind of breaking through the first time. And this is part of the issue with a lot of the kind of media and content that goes out. They make statements such as, this is the one way to do it. It's like, well, there's not one way. The context is very important, right? So if you've made a bit of money and you want to continue for a long time, well, then you kind of have to abide these principles. If you've got kind of no money, no success, and no experience, well, then you kind of want to abide by these principles. They're two very different sets of principles. Right?
Yeah, it's depending on the returns you're trying to go for as well, like alpha returns or active returns or passive returns, depending on what returns you're going for is going to be the way you act a lot of the time.
Yeah, knowledge and experience will have, knowledge, experience, and risk tolerance will have a massive relationship to return profile. Most people don't have knowledge, experience, and risk tolerance. So what do they buy? Well, they buy bonds, term deposits, and public stocks or property. Typically speaking, kind of moderate to low risk for typically speaking kind of normalized moderate returns over multiple cycles of investing.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing with the whole like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger statement. When you've got no money and you're trying to follow their principles of only getting low returns, you're going, okay, like the goal, if you're trying to be wealthy and create a lot of wealth, you kind of need to get these alpha returns in business and then park that money into the more passive returns as well.
Well, theoretically, right, and you're in a simple sense, if you look at, if you were to do an analysis of kind of any decently performing business, however you define decent, compared to the kind of net average return of investing your money in a blended portfolio across your kind of stocks, property, and bonds or term deposits, for example. And if the rules of the portfolio were you invest the money, if you make money, you just reinvest it. So there's no logic; it just rolls, it perpetually rolls. And you compare that to kind of a decent performing business. If you run the business and it's decently performing, theoretically, the net return on capital or the IRR of any decent performing business should theoretically massively outpace the other group. And the logic and reasoning for that is, well, you're incurring substantially more risk, right, in order to do that. And not that it's a one-to-one relationship, but typically, a greater ingestion of risk is going to inflate return opportunity, right, not always actual return. And so, like, if you look at business multiples, right, what's the healthy portion of the cycle? What's the average PE ratio on the ASX? Depending on the categories that you're looking at, somewhere between kind of 15 and 30. The average is normally about 20 to 25. So in other words, if you're paying 20 to 25 times the profit effectively in simple terms for that business, what are private businesses, small businesses trade for? If you're making a few $1 million in EBITDA, depending on the category, they're trading somewhere between 3 and 7 or 3 and 8 times. So you're paying way more for the public stocks. Why? Well, the risk is lower. The return is lower. You can liquidate whenever you want. Why? So you have to pay more for that. You pay less to get the private businesses, but you can't passively invest in most private businesses. They require due diligence. They require management support, all of this sort of stuff. So it's more complex. That's why they're cheaper. But they also then present an opportunity to generate a greater return on capital in the same regard.
I need to go, like, you're insanely smart and well knowledged on the topic of business, and
some areas more than others.
Yeah. Some areas for sure. And there's going to be a lot of listeners now that are looking at this and that concept around like you're way up here and and you know, the people, a lot of time people just need that person that's 3 steps ahead that they can nearly feel like they can reach.
Yeah, this was the point before about mentoring. Yeah, so if I was working with someone who was running an econ company that was doing, so yeah, I work with a company recently who are doing about $250-300 million a year in econ. I work with another company that's doing $35 million a year in trade services, and I work with another company that does about $6 million in their marketplace business, right? My approach with all of them is principally the same, i.e. these are the truths of business, but like tactically and executionally completely different for all of them, right? $300 million person, way bigger resources, way bigger team, way bigger experience, higher level, base level of knowledge, you know, and one particular business model that has complications X, Y, and Z. Yeah, marketplace, smaller team, less resources, more junior experience and knowledge, different, slightly more complicated business model, in my opinion. And so like the idea of being my success there as a mentor or an advisor to those people is how can I meet you
and take that one step at a time.
Yeah, one step that's ahead of you. Because if I go to the person who's doing $6 million a year, I'm like, oh, well, you've got to have all of this executive team and a board and governance and risk appetite statement and this, that, and the other. They're going to be like, well, how does that make me 10 million? It has no relationship to that. And I would reasonably say, yes, I would 100% agree with you. In the same regard that if I said to, the the person doing a couple $100 million a year, oh, well, yep, so we want to implement a KPI report. They're like, we've already got that. Every function's got that. That's universal across the business. Like it's not where they are, right? And so really good mentors, to your point before, who have kind of walked that path already, really sophisticated at kind of meeting people where they are, on their journey, depending on the problems that they're trying to solve.
It's a must-have though, I guess, because then it's going to be able to actually get them to that next step as we spoke about. Yeah. But take me back to, like, you keep talking about different books that you've read, and I've seen online you're an avid learner. Yeah. You're constantly learning, and we can tell just within this conversation that you are that. Can you take me back to childhood and growing up as a kid? Have you always been really fascinated? Tell me a bit about you growing up as a kid.
Yeah. So I would love to be able to tell the story that I was like kind of super switched on as a kid and like did all this cool stuff. The reality was like I was like quite distracted, lazy for a lot of things. I went through kind of phases of like really intense study, then like nothing for a long time, and then really intense study. So I was quite inconsistent. And I think the reason it's important to highlight that is it's like that, what you did when you were 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years old kind of really has no relation to what you can achieve. There's no real relationship. It's sort of like saying that if you were inactive and overweight as a kid, you can't be kind of active and healthy as an adult, right? But I think generically, I've always just been the sort of person that likes to understand how things work in a real simple sense. And so it didn't really matter what it was. I might pull apart like an old computer or whatever it may be. Like that was
curious.
Curiosity to me, that was kind of playtime. And then I was like most other teenage guys, I'd play Xbox for 5 hours on Friday night, 5 hours on Saturday night, 5 hours on Sunday night, and do nothing. So I had a pretty, I would say in some regards, pretty kind of normal approach to life at that point. But yeah, the curiosity was something for me in business that benefited me very well. And just to be clear, whilst curiosity can kind of be an innate characteristic of someone's personality, I also think it's a skill that can be taught. The idea, because curiosity ultimately leads to just asking questions about how stuff works, and the better you get at asking good questions, the better kind of results you get, right? And so for me, I think very early on in the business journey, just being like, what metric is that, and what even is marketing? Like what's finance? What's a P&L? And I've always been able to look at those things as positive, like net positive experiences. A lot of founders that I work with look at those sorts of questions as I am insufficient. So their experience of a knowledge or capability gap is a anxiety-inducing experience. Whereas for me, it's a energy-inducing experience, because I've always perceived it as like, oh, great, I'm going to get better.
Do you think curiosity in any sense, though, do you think a caveat to being curious, you have to be interested in that thing in the first place?
I think I think you can be curious about things that you are and are not interested in. I think to me, interest is more likely going to be a determinant for action. So like,
and how long you can stick at it.
Yeah, I was about to say, and then persistence, right? So like I am genuinely curious, so I'm like, oh, well, like, what's this medication, or, what's this exercise, or, like, what's that building, or why is this XYZ working this way? And I will normally go so far as like a couple of Google searches, maybe read an article or two, because my interest isn't super high. I'm just generally curious about what it is, but I'm not super interested in kind of pursuing that. But then things that, I do have high level of interest in, that interest will normally then drive me to kind of persistence and consistency over time. So, I am, very curious about martial arts, but I'm also hyper interested in it. And so that allows me to kind of perpetually train many times a week, for a very, very long time, which then relates to me kind of getting progress. And so there's a few different extreme schools of thoughts here. Some people will say, just focus on your passion, this, that, and the other, and whatever. But that's also potentially an irrational worldview, because typically people are passionate about things that they're good at, or they believe they're good at. And if you haven't done something before, you're probably shit at it. So it's really hard to get super interested or super passionate about something if you're not good at it, don't understand it, and haven't done it. So there's a bit of a dichotomy here, in the sense that, yes, if you can find things you're interested in that also align to kind of success and goals you have, that's great, because you're more likely to kind of hustle at it really hard. But if you exclusively rely on that, then you'll live a life for 40 to 60 years making excuses about why you couldn't, wouldn't, shouldn't, didn't do things. So like, they don't kind of support one another. So like, oh, do exercise that you like. Well, I hate most of the exercise that I do that's not martial arts. Hate it with a passion. I really have a disdain for going to the gym. But mechanically and physiologically, it's a requirement for my health. So I do that to tick the box. Like, so if you only do things that you enjoy in life, or, are passionate about, then reality is you're probably going to miss out on a lot of great opportunities. And also that means that the activities that you engage in are fundamentally and factually limited to your current level of, knowledge and belief. So if you use traveling as an example, oh, well, do you want to travel to Morocco? Nah, no interest. Well, why? Oh, I don't really know what's there. I'm like, so you have no interest to figure out what's there to even determine if it may be of interest to you. It's just immediately ruled off, because the assumption is that it's not cool. Who cares?
So with interest then, to be able to develop a level of interest in something,
yep,
what would be the main factors then? It would be, because as you said before, is like, you may not be interested straight away when you're bad at it, but then once you get better at something, you can gain interest in that thing. But then is there another factor? Is it like influence from maybe someone that you like or see online, maybe that they're doing something?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, as bad as it sounds, like, whatever you kind of got to do to get like mentally aroused, to kind of engage in a particular activity, go ahead. Like, a friend of mine recently started jiu-jitsu, so he's been very seriously into his fitness for quite a long time, sort of 10, 15 years. It's become a little bit stale for him, kind of keeping it up, and he'll continue to do that, but he wants something else that's a bit more fun and, and interesting for him. And he's like, oh, I thought I might try kind of XYZ, this, that, and the other. I was like, well, regardless of whatever you try, create a rule to yourself that you'll do it 3 times a week, 6 months. And then at the end of the 6 months, you'll make a decision. Because like and he ended up coming to do some Brazilian jiu-jitsu, right? And the discussion that obviously happened shortly after he started was, he's like, dude, I just come in and get like beaten up every night and go home and be depressed, which is obviously a dramatic elaboration of the reality. But he's like, that's kind of what this is like. He's like, I'm the worst in the class. I'm losing constantly. I don't even know why I'm losing, and it's like physically exhausting, right? And
that's like, how I felt after jiu-jitsu.
And I'm like, brilliant. I'm like, but in order to determine if you actually like it, like, let's follow that rule. Let's do 3 classes, kind of a week for 6 months or whatever. He gets about sort of 2 to 2.5 months in. He's like, dude, this is awesome. And so like, just that as one example, I'm not suggesting everyone has to do jiu-jitsu as much as I would thoroughly enjoy if they did. But like, the reality is that you don't really actually know at the beginning. You have no idea. And to assume that you have any idea about what you're going to like is in some regards quite arrogant. Like, yes, you might kind of know yourself well, but you don't know that experience or that activity, right?
I just go back to when I went to that first jiu-jitsu class as you're explaining this, and I remember I broke my toe in the first class, and
happens,
and I couldn't even finish the class because I had a swollen toe, and I just remember I haven't been back since. So I kind of
we'll do training this week then. You can come out this week tonight. We'll go.
And my best friend, maybe we do it. Maybe I commit to that. I will. I'll get back into it. My best friend loves jiu-jitsu and Sam, and he brought me along. He's like, look, if I go and do some handstands with you and you got to come. I was like, okay, I'll go do that. And it was good until I hurt my toe and stuff. But maybe it is one of those things that I want to set back out. And then coming to that though, as well, when we talk about interest, were you always interested in mixed martial arts, or were you?
No, not really.
Nah.
So the entire reason that I started MMA and jiu-jitsu literally was quite a few years back now. But I was having quite a lot of success in my career, making quite a lot of money, and in the businesses and investments that I own, I was kind of the core decision maker. And in a really kind of funny turn of events, after working with my coach, he helped me realize that that's actually a very vulnerable position to be in, because in that position, I'm effectively in an environment that constantly tells me I'm right and I'm the leader. Right. So what experiences am I having to disrupt that? What experiences am I having to challenge that, kind of thesis and idea, and also normalize my perception of failure? And this is a really interesting concept in itself, right? Because a lot of people in life in general, but specifically in business, they're not so much just focused on winning. They're also focusing on the avoidance of failure. But failure and being able to engage with failure, however you define it, but being able to engage with that regularly is an incredibly useful skill from an emotional regulation standpoint. And so anyway, I was like, oh, well, you know what? I'll go snowboarding because I've never been on the snow before and it looks cool. Maybe I want to try and be cool for a change because I'm really not a cool person. And then I was like, and I'll go and do kind of martial arts because, as a kid, I was that kind of pretty small, skinny kid. And I had quite a lot of experiences with, being afraid of protecting myself. And I was like, oh, okay, well, let's go kind of give that a crack, right? Snowboarding thing was horrendous. It's much harder than it looks like for anyone who's obviously been snowboarding, they'll know. And then from a martial arts perspective, you go in and I'm a decent, kind of physically strong human. And I just got absolutely destroyed by a whole bunch of people that were much lighter than me. So it forced me to engage with failure, objective failure that was fully in my control. So the only reason I lost and failed is because of me. It's not because of anyone else. And that as an experience, I think, capacity to engage with failure on a regular and repeated basis proactively is massive from a personal development perspective.
So making sure that the sport or something that you choose is one-on-one, so it's only you, the onus is on you and it's all your fault?
Ideally, or at least some way of measuring that. Depends what your goal is, right? If your goal is just to have a good time, you can do whatever you want. But if your goal is to kind of find experiences that are going to be really good for your own development and, kind of discipline and whatever, those types of things are really good because if you think about that idea, we said at the beginning that your progress is really big early on. It's only really big if you persist, right? If you give up, you get no progress. But if you are able to persist and you make lots of really, really big progress early on, another way of looking at that is that in order to get the progress, you had to persist past some level of resistance and discomfort. So if you just go down the path of jiu-jitsu for a moment, in order to get to the point where you're not losing every position, every transition, every round, you had to continue to lose to learn. So the failure or learning gave you feedback or data that allowed you to integrate that and improve your skill level. That's part one. Part two is that by the integration of that skill level, you're able to lose less positions and less transitions and hopefully less rounds in general over time. That overcoming of failure or resistance is incredibly powerful from a psychology standpoint because you are effectively invisibly accumulating an abundant amount of evidence that says, I can do hard things. I can do hard things repeatedly and lose and continue to lose. I can then learn from that losing and progressively win. And if that, that as an idea, you can apply that to friendships, intimate relationships, business, school, sport, study, getting up early, working harder, whatever it is, it all has to do with the idea of doing something that requires kind of uncertainty, and anxiety, being pretty bad at it, objectively losing or failing a couple of times, learning from that, and then overcoming that. But it's the experience of the bad and overcoming the bad that is the value. If you just do stuff and win all the time, you actually miss out on the development of that reflex.
And then that's so fascinating. And it kind of just comes down to that thing of like, pain and hard is only relative to what you've experienced in the past.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's like the more shit you go through, the easier the shit becomes.
Yeah. In a real simple sense, that's exactly right. Like the same way that if you progressively add more weight to your bench press and hopefully you're able to kind of lift it, you are adapting. The same kind of general idea exists, from a however you want to look at it, neuroscience, psych, emotion, mental, whatever you want to look at it, that same kind of principle exists. And when you look at, again, like business people, if you look at someone who's kind of 10 years in versus a person who's 1 year in and they're in the same kind of business or industry or whatever, excluding kind of extreme variables, in a general sense, the person at 10 years will probably spend less of their time being surprised and less of their time worrying about the things that the person in the first year is surprised and worried about. The person at 10 years may have different worries and different surprises, but they'll very often be fundamentally different because they're like, oh, I'm kind of like numb to that now. That's just normal. This is just business. If you talk to people who are early on in business, a lot of the time it'll be like, oh, people problems, oh, people are so hard, this, that, the other. And I would, in a general sense, agree that people management is one of the harder parts of business. But after kind of like 5, 10, 15 years, it's like you expect it to be hard. You anticipate these problems. They're not new problems. So you find new ways of dealing with the same issues so they become less stressful and harmful.
Yeah. And even just the old thing that Goggins talks about, callousing the mind.
Yeah, 100%.
So I keep breaking down the things kind of that you're saying into like really simple terms, but I genuinely think that those are very interesting. And then the thing that you said just before as well about how you're like the amount that you grow is quick, but it's only if you keep sticking at that thing.
100%.
You can't drop off. And it's funny. It's that competency scale of how you start and you're unconscious of how bad you are, of how incompetent you are at it. And most people get into the thing and they go, oh shit, I'm conscious of how incompetent I am at this thing. And that's kind of where they leave it at that step. But it's when you can pass that step and get to that conscious competence stage where you now start to enjoy the thing. So then you're willing to stick it out more, and that progression you end up getting better and better at that thing until you get to that fourth stage of unconscious competence where you can just do it with your eyes shut.
100%. And like if you looked at that from a joy perspective, like there's a bit of a, in some regards, a bit of a U-shaped curve. It's like early on in the journey, if you can kind of commit and persist, it's quite enjoyable. Lots of progress, lots of fun, lots of new stuff. Then as you start to become kind of more conscious of what's going on and you develop more skill, there's a temporary kind of almost like boredom, this, that, and the other. If you can persist past that and move towards kind of mastery or a higher skill level, it actually then becomes much more enjoyable on the other side because you reinvigorate the challenge. The challenges change, right? But you very often find people in business who are kind of in the middle of that period. They've had a bit of success. They've got past the first few years. They're a little lost. It's a little less sexy and fun and new now because it's bigger and requires more discipline. And then a lot of people don't want to play the game to get really good because they can't sustain or survive that kind of boredom curve, at the bottom. And then sometimes that unfortunately does become their undoing, from a business perspective. Yeah.
And I guess what's interesting is you said where BJJ started was one of your coaches was saying that you need to go through more failures as well.
Yep.
And so I'm really fascinated just with the decision to go into that. I'm really interested about the decision to go into business. And I want to tie it back to something that you wrote in July 2017 when you opened up about you were homeless for a period of time as a kid. And you're living in your car. And I saw there was a photo of you with a tent and off $45 a week because you went to school one day and didn't come back from home. Didn't come back home one day at 16. I'm really interested to hear about what your thoughts were in that moment and how that painted you to where you are now, and what if that's a big driver for why you got into business and why you wanted to make money. Were you running away from pain?
So I think like in a really simple sense, and again, I always like to try to be kind of as I'm less concerned about being rah-rah and exciting, and I'm more concerned about kind of being truthful and relatable. And so through that particular period of my life, I was a teenager. I was not really conscious of my emotions. You don't really understand a lot of that now as I reflect back on that period, I can say like, oh, that was a pretty average couple of years, pretty inconsistent, across a variety of, things, kind of where I was staying, this, that, and the other. But one overarching lesson that definitely came from that period earlier in my life was that things will normally sort themselves out if you actually just try to sort them out. If you don't try to sort things out, they normally won't actually sort themselves out. And that sounds really kind of simplistic and stupid, but like there's several year period there. I'm like, oh, well, if I want a better place to live and I want to make more money to do whatever it is I want to do, and I want to have generally a better quality of life. Well, whose responsibility is that? Well, that's mine. Right. Okay. So if we accept that, Well, then what's the next step? Well, then it's doing stuff. Okay, well, if you do stuff and then eventually some of that stuff does result in the achievement of some of those goals, well, what just happened? Well, I accumulated evidence that suggests I can identify a problem, I can try to resolve that problem, I can even then resolve that problem and I can get the result. Hold on. So I just proved to myself that even in bad times, I can do things, take care of myself, and get to the next stage, wherever it is that I want to go. Well, if that's a simple concept, well, what else can I do? And then on flows the idea of getting certification in fitness, building businesses, this, that, and the other, right? And so like this is, I would suggest like a lot of personal progress in life, business, health, relationships, whatever it might be, is literally just having the courage to try to accumulate evidence that you can win. Mm-hmm. And the courage comes from doing things that you don't have any data to suggest that you'll win, but continuing to do them until you find ways to win, which then begins the accumulation of the evidence that you can succeed.
And then you also said about obviously resolving the problems and actually fixing them yourself, not just kicking the can down the road as well, because then it comes up again and resurfaces.
100%. Yeah, the idea of delegating a problem to be solved is a really interesting idea, right? So like if you have a team in a business and their job is to manage this area of the business, whatever it is, let's call it marketing, and then a problem presents itself. Well, it's their job to A, prevent that problem, or B, if it does come up, it's their job to resolve it. But if they could have resolved it, more often than not, they probably would have just resolved it, or they would have come to you with a solution. So if that hasn't happened and then you've kind of then had to go and resolve it, the idea of like delegating that, well, that's already kind of gone. And so a lot of the time, and especially for let's call them kind of action biased or action oriented founders, they don't necessarily experience those problems because they're so kind of autonomously driven to just resolve problems and away they go. There's pros and cons to that, but in this particular circumstance, very often they'll just kind of go and resolve the problem themselves, and they normally learn more than other people as a result of resolving those things. Then they normally have less problems in the long term as a result of resolving those things.
It's just taking ownership and because I guess through the ownership you grow as well. It's the same with everything, through breakups, through all the stuff, just being able to put it on you and take the ownership. I'm really interested though, because I was speaking with obviously Adam last week and EBT, and what I find with most people is to even start something like business, and it's the same with me, you need to get exposed to what's possible. And a lot of the time 100%. I've found that there's sometimes a moment in your life where you like things change, because when you were telling your story earlier about how you used to just play video games for 5 hours a day, I was the same. And I remember overnight something happened and this moment happened and all my focus and motivation just switched and went into business, started reading books, and I'd never read a book in my life. Was there a moment like that for you when you were younger and trying to figure it out?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say for me, it felt like an accumulation of kind of different incremental moments over time. So rather than for me kind of one like seismic shift, it was sort of increments of like what I said a moment ago. Like I would do something that was completely irrational to do, but I wanted to do it because I believed in it. It would work out in some way that ended up being positive. I then took that as like really positive reinforcement that I could kind of get things done. So then I would use that as like a bit of a if you want, like a slingshot to kind of leap me forward to the next thing. And that was, to be honest, that feels like pretty much what my entire career has been. Going out and, believing that something is achievable because I've either seen it done or something similar has been done. Engaging with it, even though it's a stupid thing to engage in because I have no idea how to do that. But then progressively accumulating evidence in favor of the fact that I can figure this out and I will. And so like the example here is, for me, I'm quite confident that regardless of the business, the industry, the size, the stage, whatever it may be, that I can add value to grow and improve businesses generally, because I've accumulated a lot of evidence over the last roughly 15 years, give or take, that I'm really good at solving problems and figuring it out. I might not be the one to do all the work, but I'll find what work needs to be done. I'll find who can do it, and I'll make sure it gets done, even if I don't know how to do it. Doesn't matter. And so because of the evidence that I've accumulated, I'm hyper confident of that. And that has progressively, occurred to me kind of over my career. And, to one of the points you said, we were talking about earlier on, like when people first start in business or a particular activity or a sport or whatever, there is no evidence. And that's what makes it stupid to start. Starting is the stupidest, most irrational idea that you could do, but it is the biggest barrier to overcome to take a quantum leap away from the normal population. And what I mean by that is that purely by starting and just committing to whatever it is you want to do in business for 6 months, ignore the money, ignore the success, the fame, this, that, and the other. You are already so far ahead of the rest of the population just by having the courage to engage in losing and failing for about 6 months. Like, it seems like such an irrational idea, but in that 6 months, you accumulate evidence that says you can survive and progress. That's all you need. That then compounds over time.
It's quite a delusional thing that you have to do, because you need to. You're kind of going against what our instincts, like what we actually want to do. Like you're kind of saying, all right, I'm going to put myself through shit when I know there's a comfortable path here. Yeah,
well, and this is the thing, right? So, all emotional behavior in some regard is a reflection of an emotional need, right? It's a super simple statement, but it's incredibly profound when you start to consider the things playing out in a day-to-day, relation to day-to-day activity for people, right? And so if all human behavior is a reflection of some emotional need, conscious or not, right, then you would assume, well, from a general standpoint, humans kind of autonomously course correct to the path of least resistance or least negative emotion in some regard. That's a hyper-simplified view, but let's just stand with that for a moment. That general idea, we would then take that and go, well, if that's kind of what I'm doing automatically, that must be the right thing for me. And people will often kind of, it's the universe, or it's my intuition, or this, that, the other, or whatever. I'm like, well, actually, no, it's a largely an aggregation of kind of biological processes that exist subconsciously to help make sure that you don't die, to allow reproduction. That doesn't have a lot of relation to how can I win in whatever endeavor I believe I want to win in, right? And so if you kind of play that out, it's like, well, the engagement in discomfort, uncertainty, anxiety, failure, fear, et cetera, is massively irrational. It's massively irrational to the autonomous program that we run. But it's the only rational approach if your desire, and your true desire, is that you want to have some quality of life and life experience and success or whatever above average.
Even just any level of significance at all. You need to go, it's the only way.
Well, this is the thing. It's the irrational but rational path in if you want to think about it that way. It's irrational from an emotional standpoint, but it's the only logical approach to achieving more in the long term.
Well, it's irrational, but what's the alternative? And then when you look at the alternative, you go, okay, well, that's a shit life or a normal, mediocre life, and that is irrational, thinking about that.
Yeah. I mean, I like to use this idea. It's something I use in business, but you can kind of use it in any context, which is that if I was having a debate, like a legitimate, rigorous debate with people who, there was 5 of them, me versus those 5, and they were either as knowledgeable and experienced as I am or more. Let's assume they're all substantially more knowledgeable and experienced than I am, and they have no emotional relationship to the decision or topic that we're debating. Could I convince them that the way I'm reasoning this decision makes sense? Right? And so from the idea of, starting a business, right? If you said, well, my legitimate goal is to, make X dollars or whatever it is that you want to do, right? But it has something to do with needing to engage in business. The only reasonable position to take is that you must commit to being terrible at it for a long period of time, because there's not really another rational path there, right? And let's, jiu-jitsu, same thing, or any sport, right? If you want to be really good, so, let's say you're more than 2 standard deviations above the norm from a skill set perspective, so you're in kind of the upper portion of the group, well, you need to do things that to the normal population are incredibly unreasonable, but to this population are just normal. Now, if you're really at the high end of the spectrum, let's say you play in the NBA, but then you want to be Kobe Bryant, you've got to go much further, much further down that end of the spectrum, away from normality or logic or reason for those people. But for Kobe Bryant, totally normal, totally reasonable.
But for him to get there in the first place, he had to be unreasonable.
Yeah, 100%. This is the whole thing. You want to be really good at basketball, you got to train for a long time to be really shit at it. You want to be really good at martial arts, you got to lose for 3, 5, 10 years before you're even decent, half decent, most people, right? You want to be really, 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 really good in business, however you choose to measure that, making money or whatever. Well, you've got to do a lot of things that are very unreasonable. And I'd argue almost that the most unreasonable but reasonable thing that you can do is try to, as hard as possible, find what truth is with a really keen watch on your emotions. And what I mean by that is that some people can do I'm going to launch a business, I'm going to be really irrational and put in all this time and effort, right? But if you're still letting your emotions make the decisions about what you progress with, so even if you're working really hard, but your decision making is highly emotional, it's like, well, then you're still doing the comfortable thing, right? So like, as an example, if you're not willing to say, I've been doing this for 6 months and look, I've got no results, well, clearly there's something I don't understand here. That's on me. As opposed to, I've been doing this for 6 months and got nowhere. Oh, maybe podcasting is just like not good anymore. Do you know what I mean?
So when you say find what truth is, is that meaning like being realistic with, like, what do you mean by that?
So truth and realism are very unrelated, right? Because people will very often conflate the idea of this is realistic with what they understand. It's not truth. Their realistic or reality is a representation of their comprehension of reality. So there's some.
So when you say find what truth is, what does that mean?
Well, let's use an idea, right? Let's say I sell coffee cups, and there's 3 other companies that sell coffee cups, and I'm the smallest out of all the groups that sell coffee cups, right? They are better than I am.
That's a truth.
That's a fact. Now, you could argue, oh, well, they've been around for longer, this, that, and the other, and whatever. It's like, yep, sure, and there's certainly things to consider. But the reality is, in terms of a market share perspective, they are better. They have more market share. Their systems and whatever are probably more efficient. They're probably making more money. And if they're kind of the general measures of business success, which some people would propose they are, well, at this particular point in time, they are better. Now, does that mean it is realistic, to be better than all of them? Well, that's the wrong term. It is the right term would be, is there a truth here that I could use data to reason that would suggest that I can take market share from them whilst managing, these kind of, financial KPIs, whatever they may be.
And then after you determine that, can you then go, is that realistic?
Correct.
Yeah.
Is it probable?
Is it probable?
I would prefer to use the word probable. Yeah.
Okay.
So like, I'll give you an example. Like I founded and the majority owner of a company that effectively brokers the purchase and booking of driving lessons, right? Super boring, mundane industry, right? Launched quite a couple of years back now. We're about 15 times bigger than the next biggest player in Australia. The next biggest player in Australia has been around for 55 years, right? They have accumulated massive, success from a search engine optimization or SEO perspective. So our whole game has been about, we have to compete with them on that front, plus a variety of other fronts, right? We are bigger. We make substantially more profit. We deliver substantially more lessons. We have a far higher quality of driver education, depending on how you choose to measure it, across a variety of different metrics, right? So objectively, we have done a better job at accumulating market share over the last few years versus their 55-year history. That's truth. However, the next truth is, the market in Australia has a ceiling. Fact. There's only so many people that get their license. Out of those people, some get lessons. The ones that do get lessons get roughly this many lessons. So there's this many, tens of millions of dollars a year in Australia to sell lessons. Fact. Right? It's not realistic to think that we will ever get 100% market share. It's probably not even realistic to think that we'll get 50% market share because of the way that the industry is, fragmented and kind of geographically distributed. So how do we get bigger then? Right? Is it realistic or probable? Well, down that particular path of just trying to accelerate our way into that headwind, no, probably not. That'd be stupid. That's improbable. It's unlikely to happen. So the acceptance of the fact that that's unlikely to happen will then lead you to, okay, well, then that's a waste of my energy. Well, where's the money? How do I get bigger? Oh, I got this opportunity, this opportunity, this opportunity, this opportunity. Invest my money over here because that's probable, right?
Yeah. Okay. No, that was my next question. Was like, okay, so then where's next? Since it's focusing on what's probable.
Yeah. Sure. And that's probable and aligns to your goals, right? Like, and I respect, to your point before, like everyone's at their own kind of stage of their journey, and you have their own kind of capacity to solve problems and understand, the game that they're playing. But I think like a really, really good skill here is just to try to find ways. It's like, well, what's the data that I actually need to formulate this argument? And then how do I kind of strip my emotion out of it? If I'm the guy selling coffee cups, it's like, well, is it probable that I can beat these guys? And then if I do, what would actually be the kind of like financial profile of that? Even if I did a good job, like what would it look like? And if that's kind of no good, it's like, okay, well, then let's find another opportunity. Right. And so it's a emotionlessness almost, if you will. Like there's no kind of connection. It's apathetic, in the decision-making process.
I'm hearing you talk a lot about emotions and the emotional aspect of business.
Yeah.
I really want to talk about that, but more specifically, I want to talk about the lonely chapter and the loneliness of business, because there's emotions, obviously acting on emotions in business, but I'm more thinking like the loneliness and how emotional that can be as a person in business.
Yeah, sure.
Does business have to be lonely, or do you think it's a prerequisite to achieve success, or do you think, what are your thoughts on this lonely chapter?
So if we just go back to first principles, right? Loneliness is not the absence of people; it's the absence of connection, right? And so you can be surrounded by people, but not able to connect with them, i.e. in a workplace with 50 employees, but you don't really feel kind of connected to them or whatever. So you feel isolated, and lonely as a result. And so then to relay your question, does business need to be lonely? We could rephrase that. Well, does business need to be in the absence of connection, depending on what sort of connection is that you need? I would suggest that I think any pursuit, like any core pursuit of progress or success past a certain kind of low level entry point, like any pursuit past that particular point, inherently it's a solo battle. It's a solo journey, right? And purely by virtue of engaging in that, you have to accept that there is going to be an overwhelming amount of kind of solitude and isolation in that for a couple of practical reasons. One, you're not the norm. You're not the norm. If you're doing this, you've chosen to not be the norm. So therefore, your capacity to relate in this particular aspect of your life experience, not all of your life, but this particular aspect, that was a voluntary choice to make your experience unrelatable to the majority of people, right? So then, if that's true, you can't relate to the majority of them. Does that mean you have to feel lonely and have to feel disconnected from people? Well, no, not at all. It just means that you need to take a more deliberate and proactive approach to having connection and finding connection and choosing who to have connection with. Right, so the idea here, a lot of people, and this happens quite a lot, in kind of people who are earlier on in their journey, they say, I've got all these employees or whatever, blah, 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 I just feel so isolated, they don't respect me, they don't this, that, the other, and whatever. I'm like, well, that's all kind of like redundant. It's like you have a contract with them, a transaction. They're not contracted to make you feel supported and positive. If you can get that, that's great. But they're contracted to provide a service. You don't look to your marketing agency to make you feel happy and good. You look to them to provide a service. Employment's kind of the same thing, right? And so if that experience of people in a founder perspective, you can't, have the connection that you want with them, well, then it's just a matter of finding that connection with other people. And very often that is mentors and advisors, because they can relate to what you're going to. They can make you feel less lonely, less strange, because part of the experience of engaging in the pursuit of progress, if we want to call it that, engaging in the pursuit of progress is inherently an acceptance of the fact that a lot of what you do won't be relatable to others. And so if you want to feel connected to others, you have to find people who can relate to it. And that will either be people who are at the same part of their journey as yours or ahead, in a simple sense.
And I love how you said at the start there, like defining loneliness as well, because the feeling is not loneliness in the sense that you're not getting enough attention. No. It's not loneliness in the sense that you don't have enough people around you. It's correct. The fact that you have no one that understands you. You have no one to relate to. Yeah. It's not like you have those people that you can just call that can just listen to you and just say, yeah, man, I get it. I know the feeling.
Yeah.
And I found that's that loneliness piece that I've struggled with, still struggle with. Yeah. And I just wonder, is that something that you go through and you defined it perfectly there?
So let's think about this from a founder's experience, and just to be clear, when I say this, I do recognize how hard this is and how much discipline this takes. But the general idea that would be that so if we accept what I said is true, that general people are not going to be able to relate to the pursuit of progress that you're going on, right? So therefore, you feel a loss in connection. What will very often happen is that through that loss of connection, you'll experience this negative emotion, however you choose to, kind of frame it up as, loneliness. And let's say you've got kind of a girlfriend or a wife or a family member or whatever, and you want to go and regularly, I emphasize the word regularly express to them. That's a really irrational idea in some regard, in the sense that if they're not in a similar pursuit of progress in some regard or have had some similar life experience, they can't relate to you. They therefore don't value that pursuit of progress the same way that you do. So to them, when you're kind of complaining or ranting or whatever, expressing yourself, whatever it may be, in some regard to that, unless they have quite good emotional regulation skills, that's probably quite draining for them. And it's unrelatable to them. They can't understand why it matters, right? And so once here or there, that'll be okay. That's what friendship and relationships are for. But on a regular, perpetual basis, which is very often what happens with founders, because it's a bloody hard journey a lot of the time, that can actually be quite, kind of destructive of otherwise good quality relationships that are in your life or close to you. And then when you destroy those relationships that are close to you, i.e. your kind of intimate relationship, family or friends, well, what does that do? It amplifies the experience of loneliness. It amplifies the experience of difficulty to create connection with people around us in this particular context, right? And so the idea of having, kind of friends who are in business is a good one. Everyone goes, have the best circle, blah, blah, blah. That's just a very generic explanation of one aspect of that is this loneliness piece or, connection piece with other humans. And then I think the kind of follow-on idea from that too is that, like mentors and advisors are wonderful for that, because if they've been through the experience that you've been through, they have the same passions or interests theoretically. But they can also kind of, in some regards, bring you back to reality and tone you down. It's like, well, you wanted to play. This is what playing is. So let's talk through what you're experiencing, and I'll share some stories from my heyday, and you'll kind of go, oh, this is actually just normal. Because you got to remember, you've voluntarily chosen to engage in an incongruent experience with what otherwise normal people have. But to the mentors and advisors of the world who have kind of walked in your shoes,
it's normal.
Totally normal. So it's the same thing with the basketballers in the NBA versus the hobbyists in the street court, right? And so what these guys are doing is different to what those guys are doing. Norms are very different. And so, like kind of circling back on that, it's a fundamentally lonely journey in a sense that it's largely a journey of it's a solo journey of development and progress. No one wants you to win more than you want to, right? No one is going to commit more time to you winning than you're going to commit to. And that fundamentally, in some ways, is negatively reinforcing if you choose to see it that way. And then when you start to disconnect from other people because they can't relate, that's negatively reinforcing. And so you've got to have this kind of proactive, energy applied to battling this negative experience. And just to be clear, this is a perception of the experience. Right? There's a really important thing to try to accept and understand. Business is not inherently bad. Failure is not inherently bad or negative. Failure is just failure. Business is just business. We can choose to see these things as isolating. We can choose to see failure as bad, right? It is very commonly the people that can reframe their perception of those things that are actually able to, one, enjoy the journey, and then two, typically have success where others won't, right? So you made a few examples before. If you have a relationship breakdown with a husband, wife, partner, whatever it may be, society would say, well, shit, that's a negative experience, right? Unless you were really unhappy, right? Regardless of whether you were happy or unhappy in the relationship, the reality is that's just data. This is a learning opportunity. And so, yes, that might be unconventional and hard to view it that way, but that's what it is, right? If you go to a martial arts class and you go in and you get beaten up repeatedly, you can choose you could choose to look at that and go, well, this is a reflection of my self-preservation skills or my masculinity or whatever it may be. Or you could look at that as, well, one, I'm really courageous because I keep showing up knowing I'm going to lose all the time. How many people in my life constantly show up to things knowing they're going to lose? Not many. I am brave. I have courage. I can persist, right? I lose all the time. That's bad. No, I lost, but tonight I learned this one thing. That's progress, positive. So you can choose to frame these things however you want. And the magnetic allure is to frame them as negative for two reasons. One, because typically that's just how we work from a psychology standpoint. And two, because that's the way the world frames it. Society and the media frames all of these things as bad, but they don't need to be. Why? Why does it all have to be so bad?
Yeah, I love how logical you are about a lot of things as well. And I just think, again, when the media is doing precisely the opposite and painting this story and then making all these things seem bad when, no, we're human.
Yeah. Well, their incentive is this is the thing, right? Like, it's like the lawyer and accountant right from the beginning, right? The media's incentive is to sell ads. They're going to sell ads by getting views. To get views, they're going to make shit look controversial and interesting. Like you look at the health and fitness industry and like, oh, there's good foods and bad foods. No, there's not. If you think there's good foods and bad foods, like you've already lost the argument before getting to the next sentence, right? There are foods. Foods have some nutrient constitution. Depending on your objective and lifestyle, personal tolerances and personal preference, the constitution of those nutrients and all those foods or individual ingredients are either kind of useful or less useful, more or less appropriate, either provide better or worse contributions to your longevity. They're not inherently good or bad. You get to choose how you perceive that, right? But to the media, that doesn't get them as many views. To the health and nutrition companies, they're not going to get as much sales. That's brand marketing psych, right? Or behavioral economics. That's effectively what they're gamifying. And just to be clear, that's what all business people play. Everyone who's in business and marketing is playing that game. They're all playing the same game, maybe just more or less ethically, right? But, like if we kind of bring ourselves back to one of the remarks I made earlier around truth seeking, that's all this is. Remove the emotions and perception of the thing and try to observe it really just for what it is. This is not a good or bad chair. It's just a chair. like, and I know that sounds really mechanical and kind of dry and robotic, but the reality is, like, going back to the concepts before around business, if you want to win, you've got to keep on playing. If you want to keep on playing, don't try to be smart. Try to avoid dumb things. If you want to avoid dumb things, you have to see things for what they are.
And then I guess also it's when you are being more logical about things, you're hanging on to less unnecessary weight and different dramas in your mind.
So much less stress.
It's way more freeing.
Yeah, so much less stress associated with understanding and accepting that things kind of just are the way they are. And just to be clear, this is a skill that you develop, and it's a practice. You have to practice this every day, forever. It never stops. I have a kind of basic understanding of these things, and I'm on my journey too, and I'm trying to develop and grow here too. But there's still days where certain things happen. I'm just like, oh, for fuck's sake. That still happens to me. Yeah, it still happens to every other business person. Yeah, like even people who appear seemingly incredibly calm on the outside, they're not immune to frustration. They just have developed a good skill to tolerate it and deal with it and accept it and manage it. That's the difference. It's not that they don't experience it, right?
I'm sensing a lot of lived experience too. What I find with a lot of people online is a lot of the stuff that leaves their mouth is just regurgitated from what other people say online. Yeah. And to find the difference between someone who's actually done it and someone who hasn't is if the things that leave their mouth is unique. You're saying a lot of things today that are very unique, and there's things that I haven't heard before, and also people listening haven't heard before. So it's really cool to see that you've lived all this experience, and you can really tell it.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is when we were talking about like the thing that stuck with me just before was when you were saying, what was the thing about you're talking about people, what was it? Oh yeah, how you have a bad, like a bad thing that happens in business and you put it out on your partner and over a regular time and saying it time and time again, it's like then their interest in it isn't as big and important. And then you're saying that's how it's important to have those people around you, like mentors.
Yeah. And this is a really interesting idea just in relationships in general. People think that, like, one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is that every relationship and every friendship has to be for everything. When that's a very high risk idea. It's a very, very high risk idea. If anything, it's actually better to kind of go the other way. It's like, I'm really good friends with this person in this context, but I don't really see them outside of that. We have a great relationship because we love that thing together. Yeah. And so like I have, people who I love to kind of exercise with or love to do jiu-jitsu with or whatever, but I don't really hang out with them for ages and talk about business because I don't give a crap.
But the thing is about this, which is really fascinating, is do you find when the divide happens in a relationship because you're onboarding too much of your business problems onto them, is because they don't have the other people in their life that they can vent those problems to?
Well, potentially, but it's also a lot about understanding, understanding and respecting expectations and boundaries. So like, the expectation, typically speaking, in Western society, I engage in an intimate relationship, we're hopefully going to kind of build strong love for one another. Generally, people will get married and have children and do all these sorts of things, right? And there's a set of kind of conventional general expectations that come with that. And then, as everyone would respect and understand, every relationship has their own kind of nuanced version of those rules, along a spectrum for each particular thing. And something that is commonly assumed is like, oh, well, my partner should just be able to tolerate and support all of my negative emotional load. And that's a really, really unfortunate way to view the world for a variety of reasons. One is that if you think somebody else can tolerate all of your emotional load, you're actually foregoing your own agency and autonomy. You are giving up the idea that you can regulate yourself.
You're not full within yourself. You're dependent.
You've effectively waved the white flag for a start, number one. And number two, that therefore means that you're putting all the pressure of your own kind of sanity or happiness or whatever onto your partner. Because then if they can't satisfy your need to kind of vent and offload stress, well, then they're failing in your eyes. So you're setting a huge list of very unreasonable expectations on that particular person.
And does that develop a level of resentment?
Very often it can. So it can make you resent them. It can make them resent you. And then, this is kind of the unwinding of a lot of relationships, not just because of business, but yeah. And so the idea of kind of setting or resetting, managing and respecting boundaries or expectations in relationships is critically important, because also as well, that's not to say that your intimate partner should never provide kind of any support to you. That's not true. But I think understanding like how frequent, to what level of intensity, and also like what's your expectation? Is your expectation they kind of just sit there and listen and then say they love you and everything's going to be okay? Or do you expect them to resolve your problems? Or do you expect them to decelerate your emotions? Yeah, kind of what's the thing, right? And very often people misappropriate this idea. They're frustrated and they want, someone close to them to resolve their problem, but it's not their problem. They don't have the skills or interest to do so. And then so the failure of that, that's a bad outcome for all parties involved. And so I think, this obviously came off the back of the idea of loneliness. The resolution to loneliness should be proactive. The resolution to managing your intimate relationship and kind of how much you rely on them and what you rely on them for should be proactive and deliberate, not accidental, at least insofar as if you want to have a good long-term relationship. It's no different to business. If you want to have a good long-term sustainable business, a lot of proactive effort and discipline is required. If you want to have a great relationship with your husband or wife, a lot of proactive effort and discipline is required, because business won't always win. That's hard. Business won't always be easy. That's hard. Relationships won't always be positive and happy and joyful. That's hard. But the proactive effort and discipline will A, reduce the likelihood of that, and B, make it more tolerable and survivable in the interim, right?
So respecting the boundaries and making sure that they're in place in the first place. With that said then, like business, as you mentioned, it can be chaos. There's a lot going on, right? It's definitely not this linear journey that's amazing, right? That it's filled with highs and lows and busier times and less busier times. And I think there's obviously different sprints in business, etc. But when we tie this back into boundaries and relationships and having that romantic partner in your life, when most of your day is in business and in this chaos, what do you think are the important things when you're looking for a partner? You go, I need these characteristics to help combat my busy chaos life. What are those things?
Yeah, well, I think if you're looking for the perfect partner, the first thing that you need to do is become the perfect partner. Because to expect to find someone who perfectly satisfies your needs, if you can't even satisfy your needs, convince me of that.
Yeah, right? How do you know what your needs are?
Yeah, so I think that's a really big one. Like making yourself a great partner to yourself makes it fundamentally easier to find a great partner, because then you have less expectations and requirements. So there's a kind of almost like a counterintuitive paradox here, that is that the more that you seek the perfect partner, the more you are foregoing the necessary responsibility and skill to take care of yourself. Therefore, you're less likely to have a good relationship. The more you are willing to be honest with yourself and find ways to take care of yourself, manage your own emotions, manage your own life, the less needs and requirements you have of another person, so you can actually engage in having a proper romantic and intimate relationship.
So the more full that you are within yourself, I guess that's the key. Because if you can be full within yourself and everything else becomes a bonus.
Yeah, so I'd say, to be hyper-specific with the language, I'd say the more capable you become at taking care of yourself in a universal sense, so financially, socially, emotionally, mentally, physically, et cetera, the better that you are at being able to do all of that yourself, which, just to be clear, as a well-lived, sophisticated adult, you should be able to do all of those things. Because if you can't, how desirable is that to somebody else? If you can't financially take care of yourself, is that desirable to someone else? Not so much. If you can't physically or hygienically take care of yourself, is that appealing? No. But then if you were looking for someone, you would want someone who's financially and hygienically and physically and mentally well off, or at least decent, based on your own assessment. So if you're out there looking for that, you sure as hell better make sure you're at least there or above. Because otherwise, that's like taking $10 to a store where everything costs $20. It does not make sense at all.
And then obviously being that person so you can attract the person that you want to, so important, I guess.
Yeah, correct. Being that person so you can attract them, but also being that person so that you know that even if you don't attract them right now, doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're full within yourself.
Yeah.
I love that. But I think what's really cool to tie into this then is, what are your thoughts on having a partner when you are building in this build phase? Because if you're saying you need to have all these ducks in a row before that can thrive. Because when I met with, and this, I'll just quickly talk about this, is when I had Simon Beard on the show, founder of Culture Kings, he talks about, I was talking about how I want to have this relationship that's 1 + 1 = 3. It doesn't add up. It's better, right? And he was like, well, I actually think me and Tani is 1 + 1 = 11, because we're so much bigger, but then we're also aligned and parallel, and they're helping us, helping me get to this thing. And I wouldn't be able to do it without her. What are your thoughts on timing with relationships, and can you build business with partners?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if we just temporarily remove the idea of time and then just look at like, how would you actually kind of classify a good alignment there. Well, the alignment that you would ultimately be looking for with your intimate partner is from a values standpoint. So our behavior and preferences and lifestyle, this, that, and the other may change from time to time, but typically speaking, our values don't massively change, right? So yeah, if you're someone who's like not materialistic, it's not super likely that in the short to medium term, you're all of a sudden going to become massively materialistic, right? If you're someone who has historically for an incredibly long time been very lazy and very sedentary, it's unlikely that all of a sudden you're going to become incredibly active, right? And so what I mean by that is not to say that if you have been sedentary, you can't, become active, but it's more so from a kind of values and alignment standpoint. If you ignore time, your capacity to understand your own values and then perceive and make assessments of what someone else's values are, not what they tell you, but what you observe them being, your capacity to understand that and match those two things kind of regardless of time is ultimately the first principle here, insofar as like building a business is hard and stressful and strenuous and this, that, and the other and whatever. But if you're fundamentally aligned with your partner, even if they don't build their own business, but if you're fundamentally aligned that building the business is a part of your combined goal to build a better life, you're aligned in the value of, discipline and dedication to improvement to build a better life in this particular way, well, then the stresses of business are kind of normal. Coming back to that idea of normality, that's normal for someone who has those dreams, desires, and goals. So even if person A and B are in a relationship, B might be a really hardcore career person, A might be a hardcore entrepreneur, but they both align behind the idea of hard work, discipline, progress, and goal setting, just in a simple sense. So they might live different experiences, but they're fundamentally aligned from a values perspective. The issue that typically happens for people, if one person, has kind of started a business and they're in a relationship or get into a relationship, is that their relationship, agnostic of the business to begin with, was not necessarily made on a sturdy foundation insofar as their values weren't aligned. One person might really value discipline and hard work and progress and growth in their life. The other person might really value kind of calm, peace, low stress, contentment, et cetera, et cetera. Those two things fundamentally don't align. It's not the business's fault, right? That's just the vessel for bad news delivery. The bad news being that you guys were never actually aligned to begin with, right? So if we come back to the whole like timing piece thing, it's like, and just to be clear, life is a very long series of decisions, most of which we don't understand are far more important now than we understand. So i.e., I'm going to choose a partner today. Oh, that person's kind of good looking. Yeah, we kind of like Japanese food and we really like to watch the tennis. Cool, that's great. And you start dating. But that's a decision that you made not properly comprehending that could have a very, very, very large list of kind of second and third order impacts in your life. Then 2 years later, you decide to start a business because you value growth and development, but you never realized that they didn't. So it's not the business. That was just the vessel that delivered the reality, coming back to truth, the reality that you weren't aligned.
Do you think that with the attraction piece of say attracting the dream partner, right?
Yep.
And before having all of the ducks in a row, like a massive thing has to be like, say she needs to see that you can provide, but you can't provide right now. To attract her, she needs to have the belief in you to be able to. Do you think the belief in you will suffice?
Well, is she attracted to you because of the idea that you will provide for her, or is she attracted to the idea of the fact that you enjoy engaging in growth generative activities?
Yeah. I guess where my head's thinking is like the fact that they'll be able to provide in terms of the family, have money, be able to support everything. Not the actual pursuit of earning that ability to provide.
Yeah, but I would say, whoever these hypothetical people are, with respect, it's like, well, the person A, and let's assume, kind of boy was person A, that person values, progress, growth, discipline, and the pursuit of more. They don't value the outcome of more. And the reason I can confidently say they don't value the outcome of more is because they don't currently have more, so they don't know how to value it. Right? The person B, sounds like, perhaps in this case, it's a woman. Well, if that woman values material wealth, success, status, and influence, then she is making a bet or an investment in that person. So they're not values aligned. Right, she's aligned to the future outcome of that, and that's a very unfortunate kind of misinterpretation potentially by both people, right? Person A wants to kind of play the game regardless of winning. They want to have a crack. They want to, they want to try. They value trying and progress and all of that sort of stuff. They're happy to engage in risk. The other person's not.
Yeah. So I guess like that's interesting because their values aren't aligned, but she's in the instance of this example, she's backing him to achieve the life that she actually wants.
Yeah.
Which is like,
Yeah. And I have this conversation, or variations of this conversation, with my wife, Rachel, all the time. And she's like, she's like, my primary attraction is not to the outcome of the effort that you put in. My attraction is to the effort that you put in.
And it is like having that conversation and being transparent with your partner from the get-go is really important then, I guess, because those need to be aligned before you're spending so much more time with them.
Yeah,
like the sooner those conversations can be had, the better, obviously.
Yeah. And you got to remember too, like, the really funny thing here is that most people, when they're getting into relationships, so most kind of significant intimate relationships are initiated somewhere in your, kind of 20, 30-year-old age range, right? Reality is most people have no idea about anything to do with life or themselves in that age range. None. And so, like, we would hope, to your point, like, let's have the conversation. And just to be clear, I 100% agree that should definitely happen. But most people don't really even know yet what they value because they've not actually consciously gone through the thought process, right? And this is part of the reason why I would suggest that a lot of relationships break down, not because they're bad people or they didn't have good intent or they didn't try or whatever. It's just that they, no different to going through business and failing in business to figure out what works and then have success and make money. You actually have to engage in a few relationships to figure out what you do and don't like, who you are, what you care and don't care about. Like, I know that sounds really silly, but it's sort of like saying that I won't date anybody until I find the perfect partner. It's like saying I'm not going to start any sport unless I know I'm going to win every time. I'm not going to go launch that business unless I 100% am guaranteed to make money. It's completely irrational.
Yeah. And so do you think it's a game of constantly sharpening the sword and figuring out what you want and what you don't want?
Yeah,
because like for me, I kind of look at it, if you've got like a list of things that you think are really important in a relationship.
Sure.
And then you find someone and you realize that they tick all those boxes. So you go, okay, I'm going to invest more time into this person.
Yep.
But then you get later on down the line with that relationship, you realize, there's actually a few more boxes that I think are really important and they don't tick that.
Yep.
Now, when you leave that and you go to the next relationship, you go, okay, there's these other things that I actually think are really important in a relationship. So I'm going to make sure that they tick those.
Yep. Yeah, sure. And I think part of the acceptance here too is that, no relationship, kind of intimate or otherwise, no sport, no competition, no game, no nothing, no book. None of it's perfect. None of it ticks all the boxes, right? And business is a great kind of normalizer here in some sense. Like, you can get really interested and work really hard in one particular business, and you can be the best at that particular business, but it might have a really low ceiling. It might only ever make you $500,000 a year, and that to you might not be big. And then you go, shit, that was actually like a massive waste of effort, right? Doesn't mean that you failed, doesn't mean it was the end of the world. It's just like, that particular vehicle based on where I want to go in my life doesn't suit. And I know that's a very, again, mechanical way of kind of talking about relationships, but you can have a great relationship with someone and then come to the conclusion that this actually doesn't make sense for us in the long term. A simple example would be that you very much love each other and you have a beautiful experience together, but maybe one of you wants to live in a different location, or one of your job, their job opportunity and their career is really important to them and they've been offered a job overseas over here, and then, you don't want to move. Doesn't mean it's a failure. It just means that particular vehicle wasn't the right one to get you where you want to go in the long term. And so being able to remove again, comes back to that whole removal of emotion piece. It's not good, bad, or otherwise. It just is. Just is what it is. And
it's going to shape you into the person you're going to become, regardless of good or bad.
Yeah. And again, they're all decisions. If your intimate person wants to move overseas for their career, well, that's not good or bad, because you can go, well, maybe I don't care about my career, or maybe I'm at a point in my life where that doesn't really matter, and I really do love you, and I can, my relationship with you and that experience is kind of more important than my career, because I'm just not really that into working hard. Don't really like it. And that happens sometimes. Some relationships are like that, right? But in order to kind of make the, in inverted commas, the best decisions, you really do need to try as hard as possible to proactively figure out, what actually is the reality. Kind of ignore good, bad, or otherwise, like what actually are the facts. And this is, relating that back to business, it's like, this marketing campaign happened. It was awesome. I loved it so much. The images are great. I'm like, yeah, cool. Sick, mate. What were the results? We can talk about how much you enjoyed doing it before or after, and how harder or easier it was to deliver. But that was fundamentally a deployment of capital. Show me the results. But not a lot of people, like, that's a really hard kind of skill set to develop and a bridge to cross over, because it's really hard. Like, let's just say, for example, in that hypothetical scenario, campaign was brilliant. Everyone worked super hard to deliver it. The creative is wonderful, but the results are terrible. Not a lot of people want to engage in that, right? Because it's hard. So this same kind of persistent theme of proactively engaging in hard things and utilizing that as an opportunity to develop the skill to engage in hard things is, if you could do nothing and you could take nothing away from any business book or any development book or nothing at all, other than the simple idea that your capacity to engage with really hard, uncomfortable things that must consist of uncertainty, right? So hard things that are uncertain, that you will likely lose. Your capacity to engage with those things over time is going to be one of the largest determining factors for the future of not just your career and business or whatever, but the outcome of every activity and relationship that you have in your life from whatever the current present moment is until the end.
Do more hard shit. The hard shit gets easier. I want to talk about reflection
Sure.
and something that you posted on social media in regards to reflection.
Sure.
And I was really fascinated by this.
I don't know what time of the day or week it was and what was on my mind, so I'm curious to see what piece of content you're talking about.
Yeah. I've lost it, which is awesome. But I'll just cut this part out.
Yeah, you're right.
As if I was literally on the thing, and then, here we go, right here. Awesome. Here we go.
Sure.
So you were in hospital, and it was November 2021.
Yeah.
And what were you in hospital for? Just here.
Yeah.
ACL?
No. I think if I'm getting my timeline right, that would have been, I had some unknown infection. Initially, the medical team thought it was meningitis, which can be quite serious. And so, I was having some pretty severe kind of symptoms as a result of that, quite a lot of discomfort. And I was in hospital for, I don't know how long, a couple of weeks, I think in the end it might have been for that particular time, because I experienced that twice in the last 4 years. And it was a really, really interesting and reflective time, kind of what's in your control, what's not in your control, how much you value time that is in your control, but you realize you're kind of doing nothing with it. All these interesting.
I'll read the caption. You said, take action today for everything you want and love. Recently, I had a minor health scare. As a reflective person, this presented an amazing opportunity to sit for about 7 days in a small room in hospital and reflect on all the great things that are happening around me. This got me thinking about how other people use or don't use the power of reflection in their life. Reflection is often a great stimulus to put us into action. Unfortunately, people often wait for significant shocks or meaningful life events to start their reflection. As a result, there is large gaps of time between when they pick themselves up to take action and prioritize what they are passionate about in life. Every day is a chance to take action, but we won't always get a chance to have another day. Reflect early, reflect often, reflect deeply.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm fascinated just because I'm big on this too, because I really struggle to reflect sometimes, and I struggle to appreciate how far I've come. But I found it's actually a really cool tool to slingshot you to where you want to be.
Yeah.
Talk to me a bit about reflection and the importance that has been on your journey.
Yeah. So the purpose of reflection ultimately is to observe kind of recent or historical events that have happened, try to get a slightly different view or perspective on that, access the data effectively from that experience, and then use that to generate insights and or changes to your approach in the future, right? Like, we don't reflect for the sake of just doing the same thing. We reflect for the sake of learning, right? And so, from my perspective, if we just create a hypothetically extreme scenario, right? If you lived your entire life and you never ever reflected on anything that happened, well, you would effectively live the same period of time at the same daily experience, effectively kind of forever. Because in the extreme scenario, no reflection means no integration of new knowledge, right? And so if we then kind of invert that, it's like, well, if you wanted to make the best decisions and we believe that better decisions will make a better life for us, well, then you would constantly engage in reflection because it would make sense. It's important to delineate between reflection and rumination. So rumination would be the kind of negative emotional experience of over-reflecting, if that makes sense. But I think from that perspective, if you really understood the value of improving decision-making, then you would constantly reflect, right? And so the more that you reflect, the better you get at reflecting. Right. And so to use a simple example, we could, substitute the word reflection for studying something that happened, right? So let's say you were training in jiu-jitsu and you were constantly losing. You started to film your training and you watched your training back. You could go in slow-mo, you could zoom, you could pause, you this, that, and the other, and you could see the exact moments where you were making good or bad decisions, right? That capacity to reflect on that information, collect that data, integrate it to your new approach will massively improve your decision making. If you just go and train, don't ever think about it, don't ever watch it or study it or whatever, then you have no capacity to observe that data, right? Same thing, you kind of in your own life. You have arguments with your significant other. You wake up, you forget about it, move on. It's like, well, why did the argument happen? Did you do a good job in that argument? Did they do a good job in that argument? Was there a good outcome? Are we allowing all these sorts of questions or whatever, like, and without answering those things, you kind of just live, unconsciously in some regard. And so I think, we can run on the assumption that most people want to live a better life, however they choose to define better and what they're willing to sacrifice for that, et cetera, et cetera. But it kind of all starts with the idea of like reflection, insofar as that just provides the opportunity for new learnings in a simple sense.
Do you think that a lot of people use reflection as a tool for procrastination?
Yeah, perhaps. I probably need to think on that, I think, a little bit more. But I think, I would wonder whether or not that'd be crossing into the bounds of, rumination, right? Like, I'm just spending time thinking about this with no kind of net positive result. I'm negatively spiraling as a result of that reflection. Does that make sense? So
yeah, and then also where I'm thinking is you've come so far.
Yeah.
And so what you do when you're struggling is you look at how far you've come.
Yep.
And you keep reflecting at how far you've come. And by doing so, you get this little dopamine hit. So then you don't do the actions that you need to do to get further.
Well, yeah. And even if you look at the example, like, I just did something in business and, like it abundantly failed, right? Your reflection, coming back to the perception piece from earlier, your reflection on that could be that that's a bad thing.
Framing.
Yeah. Your reflection could just be that's a thing. I tried to do this and I believed that this was going to result in this outcome. It didn't. Awesome. Something I believed was not correct. Awesome. What did I believe out of all these assumptions was not correct? That one. Awesome. Now I know that's not a reasonable way to make this decision. So you can look at this as, and I commonly say this to people, I'm like, what's the awesome here? Yeah, awesome. It was wrong. Cool. Why? This. Awesome. Well, what does that mean? This. Oh, awesome. Well, and you just continue to go, down this path of that reflection. And I would argue that's what reflection's about. Reflection is not about, kind of asking these like open-ended questions to create an environment for circular reasoning. Your reflection is about trying to understand. Right? I don't just recall previous activity for the sake of recalling previous activity. I'm recalling it because I want to understand it better. Because in the moment, my sensory system is overloaded in the experience. Afterwards, I'm not.
So having intention with your reflection, I think is something that's so important, because you can just reflect to kill time, and give yourself a kick out of it. We're coming towards the end of the show. What I want to do is just go through a couple of little quotes that you've said online as just like a little closing speed round of quotes.
Sure.
These are all ones that I love, and we've spoken about some of this stuff, not directly, but indirectly today in this chat. But we'll go through a few of these, and then we'll wrap up with anything else we might want to talk about. The first one is, application is the evidence of learning.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
So basically, the reflection thing, right? Like if you keep doing the same thing, then you're not applying the learning from that reflective period. So therefore, you've not learned.
Yep, 100%. And we've been speaking about this a lot, right? A lot today. Application is the evidence of learning. I think, it's a big one. This one I love is, society says be yourself. Also society, no, not like that.
Yeah. I think we spoke a little bit about the way that kind of media creates and sensationalizes what's normal and this, that, and the other and whatever. And unfortunately, I think that creates a very unsafe place for people to actually be who they are and be authentic and genuine, because it creates the idea that that's normal. Therefore, anything out of that is abnormal. Therefore, if I'm abnormal, I'll be rejected, because a lot of social media and public media content is about rejection of someone's approach to something, right? You get hacked at or cancelled or, whatever the most recent word might be. But coming back to one of the overarching themes we spoke about today, if you want to get massively ahead of the entire or of the majority of the population, have the courage to start something. Well, if you want to be massively above the majority of the population in terms of happiness and joy, have the courage to just be you. Because most people aren't. We're all wearing masks, right, all the time. And I think like the one thing that's brought me more happiness than anything else in my life is actually just kind of getting over the fact that no one cares. And if someone cares, they don't care. It's actually that I care that they care. So that's my problem. And so trying to get to the point where you can just be you. And honestly, my relationship with Rachel has probably been the best thing in my life for that, because she's been a really great reinforcer of that for me. But the idea of kind of shunning, I refer to this as like shunning orthodoxy, ignoring the conventions that everyone has, and to say, well, I'm just going to do me, regardless of the outcome. I'm just going to do me.
Realizing that you can't win and impress everyone as well.
Not only can you not win and impress
What's the
everybody,
point,
but
though?
also that's not the goal.
Yep.
Like, and it's this very like simple, but very much circular argument. It's like, oh, I want to be really happy. Well, why am I unhappy? It's like, oh, I feel rejected by these people. It's like, okay, well, does that matter? And like, that's a really easy thing to put into words and say, but then to accept the idea that ultimately, no, it doesn't matter. Actually, you choose the very small amount of people whose opinions you care about. And even in that context, you still decide if you agree with their feedback, if you find it harsh. But at the end of the day, the reason why most of us are so pent up on those particular experiences is actually because we're not super happy with who we are or how we are. We either don't like us, or we pretend to be a way so other people will like us, but they don't like that anyway. So then we don't even like that version of us. And then that's a bit of a, perpetual negative cycle. But I think, when you can meet people who you get the feel that they are inherently like that, they are actually just being who they are. And normally that means they're a bit quirky, this, that, or the other, because they're not conforming to societal norms. I actually think that's a really nice experience to have as the person meeting them, because it almost provides me a sense of freedom, if that makes sense, which is selfish, but positive.
And also it's exciting to see, and you have so much respect because you know how hard that can be to do sometimes, especially when everyone
100%.
else is wearing a mask.
Yep.
And I kind of look at all the greats and all the people that have extreme levels of significance in their life. All of these people, I feel like they're being themselves a lot of the time as well. Some of them maybe aren't, and they're fitting to the societal norms. It's just why they're succeeding. But I also think a lot of the people that have these unique viewpoints and that also touch on things and don't just be a yes man and say their own thoughts. These guys have blown up and have gained a lot of traction because they're being themselves and they're being authentic.
Everyone disagrees with lots of stuff that Steve Jobs did. Everyone disagrees with everything that Warren Buffett says about investing, or they do agree, but then they somehow don't replicate it and then say that it doesn't work. So it's all, it's always disagree. And you can often find with people, it's a kind of an interesting barometer, but if you never disagree with anybody, one or both of you are full of shit. Because there is a 0% chance that two individual people agree on every topic, or even most topics, and especially in business. And
that's why a podcast that's always just agree is never going to go well, because everyone's like, okay, well, who's lying here? Like, who's being fake?
Yeah. And a lot of the time it doesn't need to be big deals. Even in our conversation today, you've said, oh, it's X, Y, Z. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I mean, I would probably frame it as this. Yeah, so it's not that it's wrong. It's just that my perspective is subtly different. That doesn't need to be negative. It just is.
And I guess through the debate, and it's not a negative thing, but through the debate, we come to conclusions as well. Like where even early on in the conversation where I was like, well, I actually feel like my happiness is tied to progression. And you then elaborate on that. And then I go, oh, wow, that makes so much sense. And so, but if I didn't even say that in the first place, then we wouldn't have even come to that conclusion as well. Well, I wouldn't have, at least.
And so the simple reasoning here is that, like, honesty, requires, we'll do it the other way around. So authenticity, so to be who you are with no, kind of conventional upholding to society, being who you are, being authentic, inherently requires a huge amount of vulnerability. In order to be vulnerable often requires a massive amount of courage. So to be who you are, you must inherently be courageous, right? To start in business, you must be courageous. To debate and disagree with friends, family, and partners, you must be courageous. And so that's why I said earlier, this constant idea of engaging in things that are uncomfortable, uncertain, and hard, or you're afraid of, being able to proactively do that and tolerate it as a skill is so valuable from a development perspective, because it actually is the beginning of the journey of you becoming you, right? So capacity to be courageous will allow you to be vulnerable. Vulnerability will allow you to be authentic. If you want to be authentic, you need to be courageous and brave. That's the beginning of your journey to becoming you. And a lot of people will throw these words out like, oh, you're just so authentic, this, that, the other. I'm like, well, how are you like actually defining that? You don't. know. Like it's a misnomer for me to say, oh man, you're just so authentic. That's a judgment I make of you. It feels like you're being you. I don't actually know. Only you know. Right?
Yeah.
And this comes back to the whole solo experience of life. This lived experience is yours and yours only. Right? Only you know if you're being truly courageous or not. And your courage has no relation to someone else's. It's a unique experience.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So be courageous, be you. The final one I want to talk about is another one I just love. Obviously, I love every one of these I put on. I absolutely love. But this one hits home a bit because, and I want to talk about a few other things on this, but being a leader doesn't require a title. Having a title doesn't make you one either.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
that just is the thing is that comes to mind straight away is the difference between a manager and a leader.
Yeah.
And you know what I've found so much is like in jobs that I've had as well is when you're working in corporate and stuff and people are progressing up these ladders and they're once a team member and they're this amazing leader, they're helping you out and they're showing all the characteristics of a leader. They then become the leader, the manager or the team lead. And now there's this divide there and they actually, they change because they're now this manager and they've gone from being a leader to a manager and they're two different things.
Yeah, the common mistake that people make, regardless of how they get to or are put into a leadership position or not even in a leadership position, but the common mistake that they make is that they think that there is absolutely any status associated with being a leader. That is a complete wrong way of thinking about it. Like being a leader or in a leadership position is either the acceptance or voluntary acquisition of responsibility. It is a huge responsibility. Yeah, and like one of the things I commonly relate to people is I'm like, they will talk about, oh yeah, what's the org chart and what people report to this person, what are the reporting lines? And I'm like, yeah, cool, they're reporting lines because they should be kind of giving you information about what's happening, but I'm like, it's actually the other way around and it's a supporting line. And the logic kind of goes as follows. If you are a leader and you have, 5 people that report to you, if those 5 people fail, you're a terrible leader. The only way those 5 people win is if you support them. You're their servant in some regard. And this idea of servant leadership has been perpetuated by certain people, but like you are working for them, not the other way around. And the only way you can get to that point is if you accept that leadership is not about ownership. Leadership is about responsibility, right? Leadership is about responsibility and accountability. You are employed in this role to lead and or manage these people to achieve this outcome. The only rational way to achieve that outcome is to make them successful because you're not going to do most of the work. They'll do most of the work. So therefore, there is no status with leadership at all. But most of society, get that wrong. And most of society think, oh yeah, I'm CEO or C whatever O, or I'm the founder or shareholder. You should respect me. What? You're an asshole. I respect people that are worthy of my respect. I do not respect you because you have a job title. I do not respect you because you are wealthy. I could not give a shit about any of that sort of stuff. I respect people who behave in a respectful or respect-earning manner. I'm not just going to give you respect on day one. I talk about this sometimes as similar with the idea of trust. You have kind of granted and earned trust or granted and earned respect. You should ideally live your life from a general perspective that you start with a general base level of respect for every human. This is just a general level that you give people. And that's kind of like a currency that goes up or down based on observations, and experiences with that particular individual. If I meet everyone and my respect level for them is here. If they're a founder, a shareholder, a billionaire, broke, a janitor, my respect doesn't go up or down at all based on that, because that would be an assumption. That would be arrogant on my behalf to make an assertion about them. It's based on my experience with them. They gain or lose trust or gain or lose respect as a result of that. You don't just get given it.
I'm trying to tie this back to how I gain respect for someone.
Sure.
And I feel like it's when I'm looking at the things that they've done and they've got some credibility in that space and I'm trying to get to where they want to be. So I go, okay, I respect that you've done that. Yep. I've tried and I've actually failed. It's hard and I can see that you've made it out the other side. I gain respect for that.
Yep.
Or just those little things that slowly build up. And I guess when you have that baseline of respect for everyone and then you slowly build up these little bits more until you respect them a lot.
Yep.
Do you think respect can be lost extremely quickly? Like it takes a while to earn, but it can be lost really quickly?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the whole, I can't remember the quote here. There's a really good one for it. But yeah, in a simple sense, basically, it's gained in drops, lost in buckets, I think it is, or something along that line. So it's that you gain trust and respect, over time, very incrementally. It's very hard earned. Yeah, but then if you do something kind of stupid or unethical or untrustworthy or whatever it may be, you can lose a lot or the most of that kind of in one foul swoop, right? Yeah, and so especially especially from a leadership position, because the behavior of people who are perceived to be in positions of power, influence, or status, and I emphasize the word perceived, right? People who are in those positions that are perceived by others, typically their behavior is more critically assessed, right? So, if a very senior politician or CEO or wealthy individual, whatever they may be, if they do something that is, kind of otherwise like pretty ordinary, like a decent portion of people would do, it's probably not the right thing, but, everyone does it, kind of who cares? They'll get slaughtered for it, right? Because there's eyes on them, like in an organization, like if you ask everyone to put the coffee cups in the dishwasher and if everyone does it except for the CEO, well, there's going to be a lot of like frustration there. Being CEO doesn't give you the right to not wash a cup, right? Although a lot of people unfortunately fall into that, kind of behavioral pattern. And so, I think a lot of this, ego and or kind of, humility in the inverse, drives a lot of those kind of unfortunate behaviors. But, you got to build it over time, and then you have to be very good at kind of maintaining that. Right.
I've loved this chat. I want to commend you as well, just from I can just tell that you've obsessed over this and just the way that you articulate yourself. I can just tell that there's been a lot of passion in that, a lot of time, and there's a lot of respect that comes with that. So I do want to commend you for that. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like a lot of people will. Before we tie it up, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Is there anything you feel like is exciting you wanted to share? Or
no, I mean, look, I think that one thing that you said earlier that we spoke about for a while was the idea of loneliness on the journey. And I think that because I've certainly have a very intimate relationship, with that particular experience. And when I say that, I don't mean that I experienced that a long time ago. I still experience that. I still have this experience now. It is a recurring experience for me, at new levels with new nuances and whatever throughout my career. Even now, after having built and sold a few businesses, I'm building more now, investor, this, that, and the other. I still have that experience. And the reason I want to mention that is because that the feeling of loneliness or lack of connection with people, in a general sense, it's really hard. Like, it's a really sad experience to go through. And so I would just want to highlight, I think, in closing, that much like a lot of the other conversations today, whilst this may be kind of blunt and harsh, acceptance of that position of loneliness is a choice, right? And so you don't need to be lonely. You don't need to accept that as a norm, kind of following some of the conversations from earlier today. You don't need to accept that you are lonely. You can accept that loneliness is a part of the journey, but then you can take proactive steps to reduce the negative impact of that on you, whether it's, finding mentors or advisors or doing some form of kind of study and personal development to build better skill set to navigate that. But I would just want to make sure that, as people kind of take that topic away specifically, loneliness in this journey in business, not in all contexts, but the loneliness that people experience in business is a choice, and it's not one that you need to unwillingly accept, right? You can choose to improve and or progressively resolve that if you want to. It's hard, but it can actually be done. And that's coming from someone who has, for well over 10 years, really struggled with that idea. Now, that's been a very, very hard thing for me to, understand. And even more broadly speaking in my life, I have my own quirks. Coming to the authenticity thing, I'm a quirky, intense, obsessive individual over certain topics. That's the way I am, and that doesn't gel with a lot of people. Well, I'm good with that because I'm happy with being that. But coming from someone who's had a really, really kind of challenging experience with the loneliness piece, I would hate for people either to listen to this conversation or just in general have that experience through business and thinking that they can't help themselves. It is manageable. It is tolerable. You can find ways to do that. And I would just want to make sure that people hear this closure and then use that as a stimulus to take some form of action to improve that, because it doesn't need to be that way. Business doesn't need to be lonely all the time or stressful all the time or sad all the time or isolating all the time. Business can be hard and fun. That's the way that it should be.
Do you think that loneliness is one of the toughest things on the business journey?
100%, because it has very special ways of presenting itself. So what's wrong with failing? Well, most people, part of the perception of or aversion of like fear aversion or fear avoidance from failure relates to the fact that they don't want to be alone. Well, fuck, if I fail and lose my money, well, then what? Then I'll be alone. Or I'll lose my wife, or I'll lose my family, I'll lose respect of the people around me, I'll end up alone. So it's just an exacerbated version of perceived loneliness, or, kind of forecast loneliness, in their life. What's the issue with kind of being a leader and manager? People feel like they have to avoid certain conversations, opinions, or sharing certain information because it's going to have a negative impact on the people they work with. So that's prospering loneliness, right? So there's all these subtle presentations of the emotion or experience of fear and or loneliness that are kind of quite related, through the experience. So inevitably it's going to present itself, and it is bloody hard, but it just doesn't need to be that way, at least not in perpetuity.
Thank you so much, man.
Happy to be here. Thanks, man.
Really appreciate it. And if you guys have made it to the end and you're not sick of my voice yet, then be sure to follow along and drop us a review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you are listening to this. It helps us grow the show. It helps us get amazing guests just like Toby back on the show. Mate, thank you so much. We're signing out for this week, and I'll see you guys next week.
Thanks for having me, mate.
Appreciate you, man.
Cheers.